Hi, this is Paul. Those of you watching my channel for a while know I'm always playing with new stuff. So one of the things I've been playing with is Abridged, and I'm playing with the camera right now. Playing with Abridged and extended versions of my videos because my videos tend to be very long, and I know a bunch of you really like that. A number of you have also said your videos are very long and I'd like to share them, but who on earth is going to sit through a 2-hour long video from someone they don't even know? Then I could project others of my insecurities out onto that comment. So I've been playing around with abridged and unabridged videos, and I'm going to try something with this. When I post this, probably next Monday, you'll know whether or not it succeeds, because I don't know yet either, but I'm going to have a version of this video that includes the extended commentary on some video clips and some that don't. In the clip that I released yesterday, it was just one segment of my conversation with Dr. Brett Sockold. I, of course, this is one single brain here, one consciousness congress that is working through my rough draft for Sunday, which I will record later today, my Sunday school lessons, my family life, my church life, and it all flows through the same thing. And a couple of days ago, in fact, a number of people started pointing me to the Rhett and Link Good Mythical Morning. I mean, these guys have been around since sort of the beginning of YouTube. I'd never heard of them at all. They're a comedic pair, very much grew up within conservative Christianity in the Bible Belt. We're doing evangelical comedy for Campus Crusade for Christ, and then transitioned to full-time YouTubery, and then just recently came out, as it were, in their lack of Christian faith, their transformation. Now, that's the word I'm going to use for this video. And the reason I'm using this word for this video is partly the American habit of feeling safer with abstractions. So you have the good place and the bad place. You don't have heaven and hell. So we'll just use that, because transformations tends to be more of the clinical psychological term for the kinds of transformation or transition or deconstruction, or Christians might say deconversion, that Rhett and Link have been going through. Now, before I speak much about them directly, and I've got a bunch of video ideas to treat some of the common elements of their story, and these are elements that are common not only to each other's stories, but I was listening to Aaron Rodgers' story last night. I hear these stories a lot. I'm in very close relationship with people who are in the midst of these stories or have made these stories. I pastor a church where people's parents and grandparents go to church, but their sons and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren don't, even though they live in the very same town. Many of them don't go to any church at all. So this rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, is something I'm very familiar with. And after you hear enough of these stories, patterns begin to develop. But before I go into the patterns, I want to talk about the dynamic itself, because I think part of what interests people in this is, in fact, the dynamic itself. If you listen to the Aaron Rodgers interview that he does with his girlfriend, Danica Patrick, at the beginning of her podcast, she opens up basically with, her little introit to the podcast is all about transformation. Transformation is what everybody wants to enjoy, what everybody wants to possess, what everyone wants to achieve, but in a good way, good transformations, because we know that there are bad transformations. Someone who is not unfamiliar to this channel is Job, and I've got his picture down in the corner here. Job underwent a transformation after listening to Jordan Peterson, talking to me, but that was just part of a much longer, and once you get to know Job, you begin to realize that's part of a much longer journey. And so part of the reason many people on this channel have been fascinated with Job is, number one, if they went to the Discord server, the link to that is in the show notes, they've gotten to know Job. Job has has had conversations with many other people, interviewing people, and so Job has sort of become the pastor of the Discord. And Job has joined his church in the Netherlands, and Job will be going on tour with me and John Van Donk in March, and there'll be there's some video announcements about that in the channel, and there'll be some more as the venues and times get solidified. The dates are pretty much solidified in terms of the cities that we're going to. I'm going to play most of the conversation that Jordan Peterson did with David Nasser, because I thought that was a really terrific example of Peterson himself in his Petersonian way navigating the question of transformations. Because if you understand the work of Jordan Peterson and what he'd done through a lot of his work, he was all about individual transformation, helping people make their life better. That was his goal. That was his goal as a clinical psychologist. That was very much his goal in terms of the Jordan Peterson Phenomenon chapter. That was October 2016 to June 2019. Those are really the dates from his rise because of Canadian Bill C-16 up until his illness, his attempt to withdraw from a medication that he had been taking under prescription, tried to get off it, and you can look at Michaela Peterson's video about that. I'm also going to bring in John Vervaeke on this one too, a video of his from Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. That entire series is about transformation. John's religion that is not a religion is about transformation. And so when we listen to Rhett and Link talk about their deconstruction, we're really talking about transformations. And I want to make a number of points about transformations before we begin talking about their particular instances. Now, someone had commented to me, Tim who comes to the meetup sometime, because again, yesterday I'd posted a video, just a clip from my conversation with Dr. Brett Sokold. He said, well, probably a lot of people listening to them aren't going to understand everything that you're doing. Yeah, that's probably true. And so this video will probably help them orient better to what those of you who have been following my channel for a long time are much more aware of, the characters on my channel, the topics on my channel, the kinds of things. My channel is in many ways a reflection of myself, the things that interest me. This is my personal channel. This is not necessarily my church work. Nobody looks over my shoulder and says you should and shouldn't put things on this channel. Part of the reason I like doing this as a personal channel is because someone could say, well, you shouldn't do this because of such and such. Well, I'm doing the channel. They're not. This is why I keep my church. There's a church channel that has my Sunday school lessons and my sermons on one channel, but this is on another channel. I can be a little bit freer. Freddie and Paul shows on this channel. That started before my whole Jordan Peterson thing. And if you go before my Jordan Peterson videos, you can find the Freddie and Paul show. That's something that Freddie wanted to do. Freddie's a friend of mine, and he and I have been doing this, and his mom comes on and other characters come on, so on and so forth. But transformations is a big deal, and it's a big deal far beyond the Christian church and ideas of conversion. Almost every major world religion, again, a definition of religion that I postulated a few videos ago, religions are human authoring programs. And so we're all very interested in transformations. What does that involve? What are they? How do we know if they're good or bad? That's what this video is going to be about. Now, transformations take place with respect to time, and that's important. And again, if you look at my conversation with Brett Sokold, the distinction between natural and human is a complex one. I want to not lean too heavily on it, but yet not ignore it. And so we see transformations in the life cycle of a star. There's first a stellar nebula, then perhaps it's an average star, like the sun that we enjoy. At some point it will become a red giant, which we imagine, well, that would then swallow up and destroy all life on the planet Earth. And then a planetary nebula, and then a white dwarf. Why do we know this? Well, in a sense, because of light and how light travels and astronomy. We can look up in the heavens and we can, in a sense, see the various stages of this process because the light that we finally see for great distances in space is older. Star nebulas, some stars are massive stars, and then they become a red giant, and then they supernova, and they can become a neutrino star or black hole. This is the current physics says, astrophysics says this. These are the life cycles of a star. All of those things are transformations. We're more familiar with transformations of, let's say, a butterfly. Begins as an egg and then becomes a caterpillar, then a chrysalis, then an adult emerges, then an adult, and this little schema avoids further transformations, which is aging, death, and decay, and cue the Lion King, the circle of life. Well, there we have all of these transformations. These transformations are involuntary. The egg doesn't somehow decide consciously in the way that we understand conscious decision making to become a caterpillar, a chrysalis, an adult. Same thing happens to us. We are born. We don't choose the parents that we're born to. In the way that we choose whether we're going to have a Big Mac or a quarter pounder with cheese. We're born, we have DNA, we're raised, we're subject to all sorts of influences, but there are clocks going on in our body, and we, if what we see as the normal process continues, we will continue to grow, to develop, mature. There's puberty, there's adulthood, there's aging, and then there's death, and then the body breaks down and is consumed by the bacteria, worms, whatever's eating us. So transformations, involuntary transformations happen all over the place. Now, involuntary, again, in terms of human volition and anything that we currently understand in ourselves as conscious choice. And we see it all around the world. We see it in the animal kingdom. We see it over time. Now, before I get too deep into this, I again want to point to Daniel Bonavac's excellent video looking at the philosophical work of Wilfrid Sellars, who differentiates between the manifest image and the scientific image. I'm not going to play that video today. I've played it in a number of videos. The link will be in the notes below if you're curious at seeing it. He notes that there are these two images that we constantly work with, the scientific image, which is about science, and the manifest image, which is sort of life the way we live it. One of the things that you'll note in Rhett's deconstruction story is the questions about the Bible and science loomed very large in his deconstruction story, and that is by no means uncommon. Recognizing these two different visions, I think, is fundamental, and as Wilfrid Sellars noted, and as Daniel Bonavac articulates in this little video, the difference between them is the normative. And if we go back and we look and we say, well, is a stellar nebula good and a white dwarf bad? Well, those categories don't really fit. Is a stellar nebula better? Is an average star better? Is a massive star better? Well, better for what? Immediately comes to mind. Is the egg better than the adult monarch butterfly? Well, better for what? Better to eat? Better? I mean, those categories really don't fit the scientific image, but we can't live without them in the manifest image. So is a butterfly better than an egg? Science can't tell you that. Is a black hole better than a stable, mature star like the sun? Science can't tell you that. It can tell you a lot of things that are different about a black hole and the thing that we call the sun in our cosmology, but science can't tell you that. Now, normativity and what normativity does is it encapsulates the personal observer, which again is a very big issue in philosophy right now and in science. Normativity is part of the manifest image, and the manifest image has within it the observer. Okay, science attempts to be a view from nowhere, attempts to be objective. Like this is always true, or true in a moment, which is a timeless moment. And again, in my past videos, I've talked about all these kinds of things. So let's keep this distinction in mind, because It actually functions pretty powerfully in this whole question of transformations. Transformations, whereas we can look at them in a sense scientifically and we can observe a variety of things about it, science can't tell us, well, how should I feel about an average star versus a massive star? How should I feel about the transformations that go on within me? All of those involve the observer and the personal observer. All right. Now, in the animal kingdom, we see transformations all the time. So I didn't have my dog when he was a puppy. My dog is a rescue dog, so got him as a very problematic adult. And but I love my dog, even though my dog bites lots of people. Fortunately, the dog isn't a very big dog, and people seem to forgive him when he bites people. Unlike my Rottweilers, that never bit a soul, but everybody was afraid of them. So my little dog has skin problems. My dog has skin problems all the time. And for the first, 6 years that we lived with the dog, back and forth to the vet, this med, that medication, and just all kinds of issues trying to get the dog's skin clear. We'd get the dog's skin cleared up, and we have him on all these medications, and then take him off the medications, and back the skin would come. High-priced, hypogenic dog food, blah, 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 blah. Finally, my wife, in just a fit of frustration, went to the internet, and we put him on the Jordan Peterson diet. That dog eats hamburger. That's what he eats. And, well, he's not strictly on the Jordan Peterson diet. He also eats an egg. A little while ago, we tried to add a little bit more rice to the diet for some certain reasons that I won't go into. And sure enough, he starts smelling yeasty all over again. And okay, back to the hamburger. And since the dog's been on hamburger, the dog's really done very, very well. I have to put my watch on Do Not Disturb for a couple hours because otherwise I get disturbed. So he lost weight, his skin problems cleared up, he had better energy, everything, he's like a new dog, we say. Now, this is a transformation I brought to my dog. My dog eats whatever he wants to eat, whether it's good for him or not. And then once that yeast infection gets going, he scratches and scratches, and he will literally scratch all of his fur off, and he'll just have swaths of himself that are raw and bleeding, and it's a mess. I bring the transformation to my dog. Now, I don't cause the transformation. The diet is clearly involved in the transformation, but it's only the will of myself and my wife who are imposing this on the dog. Now, he's very happy to eat hamburger, and being the cheap Dutchman that I am, it pains me when I have to buy hamburger for this animal as opposed to the cheapo dog food that we began with. But, it's cheaper to feed him hamburger than to pay the vet and pay for the medicine, and everything's better. So, hey, but the point here is that I bring this transformation to my dog. My dog does not manage this transformation. To the best of our knowledge, dogs don't understand and have any kind of self-transcendence from the transformation like we have. We have all kinds of self-transcendence. We watch ourselves in our transformations. My dog doesn't watch himself in the transformation. We transform him. In fact, if you look at that little dog, people who do genetics say dogs were, domesticated from wolves. And if you look at my tiny little dog, you'd say, where on earth is the wolf in that dog? Now, maybe in his bite, but the dog looks nothing like a wolf. In fact, the dog is a victim of human transformations in terms of old-style genetic engineering and breeding so that he's tiny and cute and fluffy and has a flat face and on and on and on, but has a terrible personality. That's my dog. So he's been the product of lots of transformations from wolf down to a dog. He's a product of our own transformation experimentation in terms of his diet. And I think for the most part, we want good things for my dog. And he's done fairly well. So humans have a level of agency far beyond what we see in other creatures that we know. We have a myriad of complex hierarchies as human beings and capacity to change our environment, our level of social complexity, all of that. Not only do we have the capacity to colonize or enact transformations involuntarily from the position of the dog, upon dogs and upon just about everything else in the world, we do it upon ourselves, and we do it upon ourselves all the time. And we desire to do it upon ourselves. In fact, we desire to change ourselves for the better. And that entire process, again, we're calling transformation. And it takes many forms and many shapes. Now, there's an excellent video out there by Will Schroeder called "Every Story is the Same," and again, I'll put the link down in the show notes below. And it talks about Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey and the monomyth. And of course, anybody familiar with Jordan Peterson knows that Peterson, in many ways, now Peterson has some real differences from Joseph Campbell, which if you back him into a corner, he'll force to mention. But Jung is behind this, and so very much similar thing from the work that Joseph Campbell did a number of years ago. Now, here's the thing about transformation. We represent them, we manage them, we interact with them, we codify them, we communicate them. They're all framed by story. And again, if you look at John Vervaeke's conversation with Benjamin Boyce, which I've played in the past, John Vervaeke talks about the fact that story is a psychotechnology that we possess. And again, this is something that I thought of long before I started doing the Jordan Peterson stuff. I was thinking about maybe a book that I wanted to write because I was thinking about the fact that we are stories. And in fact, this is something that Brett Sockel mentioned yesterday. He said, I began as a seed from my father and the egg of my mother. Those two elements as such are gone, and then they unite and they multiply. That initial cell is gone, and there are all these ideas about every 7 years all the cells of my body change, and I'm not a biologist. I don't know how to evaluate that or to qualify that or to nuance that, but generally speaking, I'm a very different creature than the fertilized egg that was in my mother's womb. I'm a very different creature than the baby that my mother birthed and brought into the world. I'm a very different creature than a third grader or a fifth grader. I'm now in my mid-50s, and I'm a very different creature in some ways than I am in my 30s, but more alike of what I was in my 30s. I've undergone a number of transformations since my 30s. I have lost much of my hair. My hair has turned gray. My teeth continue to get older. Physiologically, I'm aging. I'm not as strong as I was. I'm just and strong in the broader sense. I'd probably be more susceptible to virus, but I can undergo transformations in terms of diet and exercise, medical science, all of those things that even within my adult lifespan, things will go up and down. There have been tremendous transformations in me, and in fact, one of the common questions I get from people who watch my videos is, what are the transformations that Jordan Peterson has brought in you, or what are the transformations that making videos have brought in you, and what are the transformations of on and on and on and on. Now, I think part of the benefit of doing something like this in my 50s is that in some ways the cake is baked, and the speed of transformation is no longer what it was when I was conceived, when I was an infant, when I was a toddler, when I was a preschooler, even when I was a teenager, and even in my early 20s, brain plasticity, the cake is baked. So I'm going to see lower levels of transformation. But the only way we sort of track these things or can communicate these things are by story. And this is part of the reason stories fascinate us, because stories are all about transformations. N.T. Wright, in his first book, in his magnum opus about basically Christianity in the world, he spends a great deal of time in that first book, in Prolegomena, talking about what a story is. Little Red Riding Hood is not a story. I mean, just that, Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood went to her grandmother's. Well, now we're getting somewhere, but it's not a terribly interesting story. Little Red Riding Hood was going to grandmother's, and she had a basket of goodies for her grandmother, and a wolf met her along the trail, and the wolf speaks. And now we have a story. Now we have something interesting. Now we have something that engages us. I would say that what is built into us in terms of our desire for meaning is a desire for transformation. That is something deep within us. But again, this is carried by us, understood by us, seen by us in story. I told you the story of my dog and his transformation via his diet. But My dog has no such story. My dog my dog has very limited amount of self-transcendence in terms of he can't stand back from himself and say, oh, when they were feeding me first that cheap dog food, then that very expensive dog food, and now the hamburger, my body was in different ways. My dog doesn't look in the mirror and ponder his existence to the best of our knowledge. My dog simply is. People often say, well, live in the moment. And I always think, like, my dog lives in the moment. I don't care to live in the moment. I care to live in a story that I can manipulate, that I can set myself back from, a story that allows me to look at myself in a different way, stories that allow me to see other people, allow me to sort of conceptualize other people. And all of story is very, very important in terms of how this all works. We use story to frame and track transformations. A human story is a story in a way that a dog doesn't have. We are a story in a way that we're not a body, but we're an embodied story, and we keep making new stories. And again, if you haven't watched my conversation with Dr. Brett Sokol, that was a highlight of my channel, that conversation. You have conversations sometimes and they just go so well, and you just want to get up and dance. Well, that's actually what I do in my office. I get up and I dance a little dance after I have a conversation like that, because it was just so good, and it just get meshed into a whole bunch of the things that I've been working on in my YouTube and all of that. Now we are nested stories, because not only do we conceptualize ourselves and represent ourselves as a story, we represent the world in story form. And again, in fact, we can go all the way back. I represent my dog in story form. And in many ways, the life cycle of a star is a storified representation of a star. And if you just look in a telescope, you won't see the story. What you do is you see the different elements and you create a story out of it. And it's that story that you tell to other people. And it's story nested within stories, nested within stories. Now, these conceptualizations are storified, okay? And I often, in my videos, if you go and pass them, I'll ask, is Uncle Sam real? They'll say, well, what do you mean by real? And again, my conversation with Brett Sokol made the point that for us, there are realities which are greater. Now we're introducing hierarchy, and I would see there are realities which are not material. We might call them interrelational. We might call them informational, but they are not material, and they colonize materiality. So I might say, well, is Uncle Sam real? And you might say, no, I can't. Uncle Sam does not have an address. I can't go to a place and lay hands on Uncle Sam. Jonathan Peugeot talks about Santa Claus. Is Santa Claus real? Ask a kid. Yeah, I just saw him at the mall. Well, is that Santa Claus? Well, yes. Is that the real Santa Claus? Oh, well, what do you mean? Is that actually the instantiation of Santa Claus? And I would say, is Uncle Sam real? He's real enough for you to pay your taxes. He's that real. And in fact, he's real enough to motivate young men during the First and Second World War to lay down their life for him. And so we have these principalities that are conceptualized up, and they're also conceptualized as stories, and they're also conceptualized as persons. And that is instinctive to us. All right? And now these stories, the monomyth, it's really very interesting. The hero's journey, the story, all of this stuff. There are patterns and structures to all of this, and we cannot function as human beings without them. We have agency within our stories. Our stories, in many ways, we have immaterial agents within our stories. Every time you hear someone talk about the patriarchy or white supremacy, what they're essentially doing is locating agency within a very long story. And they're saying that agency is to blame and we have to kill that agency. Okay, that's a conceptualization. Again, nobody, like Uncle Sam, imagines you can go to a particular street address, find white supremacy, and put white supremacy to death. Or find the patriarchy and put the patriarchy to death. But notice what we're doing with our stories. We're lending agency to that story, and in fact, we're placing normativity upon that agency, and we're very easily using this within our story. This is how human beings work. And in the past, this is what happened with religion. All right. Now, again, if you talk to Sam Harris, the issue of agency and free will comes up a lot. And so you can watch Why Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein Keep Tripping Over Free Will, a video that I did a few weeks ago. We feel ourselves to have consequential agency within our stories. We bear a degree of responsibility within our stories. We can pretty much not conceptualize or work communally or socially or interrelationally without this element of responsibility and personhood and agency. Human interaction, human life as we know it on this world cannot exist without this. Now, Sam Harris tries to flip over to the scientific image and say, via the scientific image, we have no agency. But then Sam Harris goes on podcast to try and convince us that within the scientific image, we have no agency. And that's where I talked about Sam Harris is kind of switching the patch over one eye. Now I'm looking at the scientific image. Now I'm looking at the manifest image. Now I'm telling a scientific story. Now I'm telling a manifest image story. So back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that's what that video was about. I played the Daniel Bonavac scientific manifest image story. But within the manifest image, we cannot conceptualize it as not being agents, and not only just human beings as agents, but these other agents within humanity. Uncle Sam, white supremacy, racism, all of these things that we basically conceptualize. And if you take it, again, I'm going to sound like Jordan Peterson, from a psychological perspective, God and the gods as agents that move us. Cupid, Mars, the god of war. Just this is what human beings have done all along, and we can't help but do it, and we will continue to do it because it's the only way we can actually work with each other and manage ourselves, because we are all these nested stories. Now, we are blessed or cursed in terms of normativity by the agency of others. White supremacy has been a curse to African Americans, especially in the Jim Crow South. Patriarchy has been a curse for women who have been victims of the patriarchy, and on and on and on and on. Let's say communism was a curse for all of the people that were in communism. Nazism was a curse for the Jewish populations of Eastern Europe. On and on and on we go. These are the waters that we swim in. And you will find, and I've made this point many times, that for the most part, when people sort of deconstruct their religion, they don't really leave religion. They just change a lot of the conceptualizations. And I see people sort of, maybe they grew up Christian, and now then they're an agnostic or an atheist phase, but before you know it, they start talking to the universe. And they say, the universe has given me this, and the universe has given me that, and karma this and karma that. And again, my best example of this is Verizon Lisa. You can go back a number of years and look at the LG Lucid Verizon phone commercial where Lisa's walking by and, she sees a Verizon store with a new smartphone. It's not really a smartphone. Those Lucids weren't. I don't even remember if they were Androids. Anyway, universe is telling me, and so the universe is speaking to her. She's having a conversation with the universe. This is what we do as human beings. We've always done this, and we're not going to stop. Now, what's interesting is that we have a bit of self-transcendence with this dynamic about ourselves. And this came out recently with Michelle Williams and her speech at the Golden Globes. And again, I'll put the links below in the show notes. But what was very interesting about her speech was that she was basically saying, my agency over my story is the most important thing in my world. And she talked about her abortion. And, what is abortion? Abortion is a degree of colonization with the help of medical professionals, because that's a critical thing that's seldom looked at. Your right to an abortion seems to be connected with the demand you can place on a doctor to perform that procedure on you. It's not simply, you don't go into a doctor and say, I have the right to choose, remove my hand. Doctors won't do that. I have the right to choose, remove my leg. Doctors won't do that. Doctors need a reason. But in this particular procedure, they offer a reason. And so this is what she says about her life. I've tried my very best to live a life of my own making. And right when I heard that, I thought, did you choose your genetics? Did you choose the zip code, the parents, the school, on and on and on and on and on? Maybe you chose your hair color, but there's the vast majority of your life you never chose. You are trying as best you can via story to colonize your body, and even, hey, lately I've been trying to go on a diet. I really haven't hit what I think is my ideal weight. So, on and off I go on my diet. I can't even colonize me very well. But I've tried to live my best life. Ooh, my very best life. Well, what is that? There's a representation out there. Again, watch towards the end of John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, the second self. There's a lot of that going on in the talk of the world, and that will be in some of the Jordan Peterson clip that I play with this conversation with David Nasser. But I've tried my very best to live a life of my own making and not just a series of events that happened to me. What is she saying? I've lived my very life in terms of a human authoring program. I've lived to try to self-author my story. I don't just want to be the recipients of a bunch of events that have happened to me. Well, what event caused the pregnancy? Was that consensual? I hope so. Probably, but it wasn't within the timing of the larger story that she had. But one that I could stand back and look at and recognize my handwriting all over. Okay, she, and you have to ask, well, what is her? What is that self? What is that person in the middle of this? That she's trying to manifest herself in her story and in her life. Sometimes messy and scrawling, sometimes careful and precise. She's using a metaphor. But again, this is she's looking for transformations, but she herself wants to direct her transformation and have that be a transformation that she sees as better, as ideal. Again, this is basic, yet it is so steeped in our particular culture and our particular frame of reference. It's extremely religious. But if there's no supernatural beings involved, people might not say it's religious. Well, it's spiritual. Okay, what do you mean by spiritual? What do you mean by that very fudgy word? Can you please tell me what is spiritual? Can you explain to me the difference between spiritual here and school spirit? If you think about that relationship, you might actually have something. If you think about, well, a corpse is a dead person, and when they have, a living spirit inside of them, then they're animated. Well, you can get into much older ideas of spirit. So why is spirit and breath? If, again, you go back and you look at the videos that I did about I almost said B.B. Warfield. Anyway, if you go back and look at my other videos, why do our language? Owen Barfield. Why do we connect breath and life? Why do we connect wind and spirit? Why all these words? Well, she's probably embraced spiritual. I don't know what she thinks of religion. I have no idea, really. I don't even know what movie she was in. I just caught this because of the whole abortion thing. This thing got shot up there on Twitter. But one that I had carved with my own hand. There's another metaphor. And I wouldn't have been able to do it without employing a woman's right to choose and her right to demand a doctor to perform a procedure on her. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. But again, she's saying agency. Agency is the goal. Whatever I am, deconstructed or not, whatever this thing is in me, this self, this story writer inside, what goodness is a world that is plastic and like putty in my hand, to the point that I can mold it and shape it to myself, and that others will collaborate and be helpful on my path towards my second self, my sacred self, my hidden secret self that needs to be manifest. Again, you start getting into this, and you're all over it. Religions are all over the place on this. Your best self, my best self now, my ideal self. I mean, this is stuff that we've been talking about for a fairly long time now in the American zeitgeist. An individual, well, go back to the Declaration of Independence. An individual should pursue their dream and their self or their life. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's essentially what Thomas Jefferson, following John Locke, was saying. And so the role of our society is to afford Michelle Williams the person that she is, the agent that she is, the self-authoring story that she is, the ability to write her own story to the degree and in the shape that she wants to see it written. Now, we aspire to achieve all levels of agency, but agency is a very funny thing. A number of weeks ago, a woman was in my church for a couple of weeks. She'll probably show up again. I suspect she lives in a group home somewhere around. I don't know her technical diagnosis, but having had a lot of experience with a lot of individuals, I suspect she's an untreated schizophrenic. And she visited the church, and we have a lot of schizophrenics that come into the church and sit and do their things. And my congregation is just pretty accustomed to all of this because, again, they've been through it for a long time. And my congregation has a huge heart, and so they often, if given the opportunity, and there have been some really interesting stories in the past where they've really helped a number of people live with their schizophrenia. She's semi-homeless, and she had a few things in bags, and so I tried to help her out Sunday, and then, she got into the Anglican church that uses our sanctuary afterwards. Well, that conversation didn't go well. But then she came back Monday, and the lady who runs the child care center here, that conversation didn't go well. So she calls me and say, "Pastor, you got to do something with this woman." So I came down and, had more of a chance to talk to her than I had on Sunday, because Sunday I'm busy with a lot of different people too. So she's from space. She got a very close relationship with God, and she's managing all those things. That same pictured used to be a cage that was surrounded an air conditioning unit to keep people from stealing it. That one day I found another homeless schizophrenic woman sitting in that cage. There's basically the gas meter is right in that cage, and of course the child care center was going, and they were a little disturbed that there's this homeless woman who's sitting there, and people are picking up and dropping off their children. And so I sat down and talked to her, and she explained to me that she was running the American space program right there from the gas meter in the no longer used cage at Livingstone's. And I was skeptical, her reality, my reality, but many of these people express a great deal of agency. Now, the agency that they express to me doesn't usually match the agency I see, but, at some point I'll usually mention to them that I have a degree of agency in terms of my responsibility towards the various organizations that use this building, and so I try to modulate that as well as I can. I usually try and walk a line, but we achieve levels of agency, and I think for many of these people, that they're from space or that they're managing the American space program from the gas meter at Livingstone's Church in Sacramento, California, and that gives them a degree of meaning. They enjoy their agency. In fact, agency and meaning are deeply tied. We sense meaning when we're exercising our agency. Okay. And again, we'll get into John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson very shortly, actually, in this video. Just this morning when I came to work, today I decided not to drive, because when I do drive and my car's in the parking lot, I get quite a few more visitors at my door, because people in the neighborhood, if they see my car there, then they know they stop in and we have a chat or whatever we do. But I decided not to drive today so that I could have a little bit more time to make videos and do some office work today. And Billy's there. Billy has been sleeping by the door. Billy, I don't know if that's his real name or not. People on the street, people give you names, and there might be names, there might be nicknames. I don't ask for driver's license, I don't ask for ID, but let's just call him Billy. And Billy, Billy will be out there sleeping for a little while. It becomes a regular, and we'll start having conversations. That's the way this thing works. And then we'll start having conversations, and we'll get them to share my life. But because I know lots of other people on the street, then they give me information about Billy. Billy's sleeping over at your church. And because I have the same drug dealer as Billy, so I know what kind of drugs he's using. And I have a sense of, how dangerous is he? And do I have to run him off right now? Or is this someone who's a little bit more... and so I'm always managing these kind of things. And when you have untreated schizophrenics coming into church, people with children begin to look around and say, is this a safe place? Sorta. I keep an eye on things, and that's what I do. I keep an eye on things, and hopefully bad things don't happen. Every now and then something bad does happen, but that's kind of life. So Billy has a drug issue. Billy has some issues with his spouse, either present or ex-wife. Billy has a homeless issue. Billy's got a lot of issues. Billy's depressed. So it's a lot of the other homeless people I know come along and they diagnose each other because they're all in and out of mental hospitals all the time. And they're all familiar with this language, and round we go. Now, homelessness is a huge issue in California right now. It's a big topic of conversation, and people want to help. People feel sympathy for the homeless. People are annoyed and disgusted. Just a little bit up there, there's a turd sitting in the grass. And when I catch Billy awake one of these days and say, Billy, you can't be leaving turds in the grass. You got to clean that stuff up. And, so Billy and I will do a lot of negotiating, and we'll do a certain amount of relating. And Billy's, I will tolerate certain things around here, and I will not tolerate other things around here. And there's a lot of difference of opinion in terms of what I should and shouldn't tolerate. I engage these negotiations and conversations also with the church leadership in mind. And, we try to walk this line. One of the things, talk about religion. In the Bible, you have the story of Lazarus and the rich man. Don't want to be the rich man stepping over this guy. And Paul VanderKlay, there's Billy. Billy's in the bosom of Abraham, and you're in the part of Hades that's getting a little hot, and they say, Lord, can you have Billy come down and bring me a little bit of water just to cool my tongue? These stories roam around in our imagination, and they seep into the culture, and they seep into the zeitgeist, and they seep into our moral structures. And so another homeless guy used to stay here a lot. He'd often, really, if there's a psychologist out there, tell me what the deal is with homeless people and shoes, please. So this and mental illness and shoes. So this guy, he never wanted to wear shoes. He's always walking around barefoot, and his feet were a mess. And people would always stop by and give him shoes. And he'd say, people are always giving me shoes. I hate shoes. And people would give him things. He'd always accept it. And then he'd kind of go through what they'd give him, and he'd keep what he'd want. He'd throw out the other, and all that garbage would stay on my property unless somebody else came along. And one man's garbage is another man's treasure, and on and on and on and on. But addiction, almost all of these people are struggling with what we would call substance abuse. And almost all of these people, and again, you have conversations, drug addicts know their drugs. They know their drug dealers, and they know the prescribed drugs and the unprescribed drugs. And, I have a lot of conversations with these people about their drugs. And, a lot of these people are self-medicating. Alcohol is a powerful, powerful drug. It's a very useful drug. Bipolars try to level out with alcohol. When they're manic, alcohol for some of them slows them down a little bit, and when they're depressed, alcohol takes the edge off. And a friend of mine, his greatest horror was to wake up sober. He didn't want to wake up sober. That might mean that he just would urinate in his blanket even though he doesn't have another blanket. And, on and on and on and on. I've lived 22. First day I came to work here at this church, there was a homeless woman sitting in the parking lot, and it's for 22 years I've just had relationships with this population, and it's just the way it goes. But people in California are frightened, and well, what can we do about these people? Let's put them in tiny houses, housing first. Let's wrap around services, on and on and on and on and on. These programs might help. Are they going to solve the problem? Probably not, because human beings are not problems to be solved, and we're mysteries to ourselves, and this is difficult. But addiction is a very big deal, and addiction has, in many ways, taken on a clinical reality, and we have approached addiction sort of in the way that I approach Mookie and his skin problems. And maybe if we can alter the environment, we can help with an addiction. And there's good reason to believe that. Now, one of my favorite videos in John Vervaeke's series is episode 13, where he talks about Buddhism, parasitic processing, and he talks about a friend of his who does a lot of work on addiction. And because, addiction is one of the ways that Alcoholics Anonymous tried to encourage people to find help in society for their alcohol problem was to try to reduce the stigma by medicalizing alcoholism. And so alcoholism is a disease. And then later on, when we had more ideas about how the brain works, there's a genetic predisposition to alcoholism. Alcoholism, the attempt was to take alcoholism away from the moral valence. Alcohol is not a moral problem. And this is where you get into questions of, should you incarcerate drug users or should you put them in treatment programs? Now, is addiction a moral question? Now, if you're the son or child of an alcoholic, or the partner of an alcoholic, or the neighbor of an alcoholic, sort of like I am right now, moral notions crop up. Okay? You should not lay turds in the landscaping at Living Stones. You should not strewn the bushes with your dirty toilet paper. You should not just urinate here so that it smells like a toilet when I have to come into my office. You should not, you should not, you should not. These are all moral questions. But then we get the question of agency. To what degree can he manage himself? And these are the kinds of questions that anyone who's dealt with an addict deals with continually. Where is their agency in the addiction? Now, John Vervaeke will talk about this in terms of, see, I'm thinking about now, I'm going to do the long and the short version of this video. John, I think the short version is going to be plenty long. John Vervaeke is going to do is going to talk about addiction in terms of agency and reciprocal narrowing. And if you listen to the whole video, he connects that with Buddhism. And I was just re-listening to the whole video on my walk here to church, so I don't have my car here, so I don't have too many bangs on the door while I'm trying to make a video. And reciprocal narrowing, that's what addiction is. If there's such a thing as reciprocal narrowing, is there also reciprocal enlargening, or as he'll use the term, enlightening? Now, if you listen to Rhett and Link, no, I haven't forgotten about them. If you listen to Rhett and Link, you'll notice that, as for many people who have undergone a voluntary transformation, even sometimes an involuntary transformation, they'll say, my life is better. Now, better in what way? To look at categoricals or universals is very difficult, but they could say, getting sober was hard, but it was an improvement. And in fact, I had one homeless person, he sat in that chair right there, and he had a can of beer with him, and he sat that can of beer on my table, and he said, my life is in that can. And this individual, he worked as a painter, and he would work as a painter, basically repainting apartments for a guy who had a lot of apartments and just needed them repainted after every tenant left. So he'd repaint the apartment, and he'd get paid under the table, and most of the time he would sleep outside because he didn't want to pay rent, because rent would take a lot of his income, and he would rather devote almost all of his income to alcohol. So he said, my life is in that can. He stood that about himself. And many of the homeless addicts that I deal with have had periods of sobriety in their life. They've been through 12-step programs multiple times. They've been in and out of psychiatric facilities, locked and unlocked, on and on and on and on and on. And they have a degree of self-transcendence about it, and they understand the fact that if you're an addict, you don't have a lot of agency. And so John in this video is going to talk about agency. And now John is a professor at the University of Toronto. If you've been on my channel a while, John has been on my channel a number of times. We have regular conversations. I look forward to sharing a stage with him in Thunder Bay, Ontario, when we do this conference with Jonathan Peugeot. I'm really looking forward to that conference. Really looking forward to meeting John and Jonathan in person and spending time with them and having conversations with them. All of my conversations with John Vervaeke have been just wonderful experiences, along with some of John's friends that I've gotten acquainted with, Guy Sengstock and Christopher Mastropietro. I mean, John's got a wonderful community around him, and some people found John through my channel, and some people have found me through John's channel, and this little corner of the internet has been a wonderful thing. But he's a cognitive scientist, and so he tries to work on all of these things in terms of the big picture. And so he makes the point in this video that it's not simply a biochemical relationship. You can be addicted to video games. Drug addiction is, if it were merely biochemical, it would look very different in people's lives. A 12-step program talking, and community accountability wouldn't be as helpful. Why does age and addiction, why are they involved? A lot of people get sober at a certain age just because of age. And, on and on and on. This stuff is different. So if you're watching the abridged version, you're not going to see the video. If you're watching the full version, you can see the video. So this is episode 13, Buddhism and Parasitic Processing.
My colleague and good friend Mark Lewis, we're talking about comparing this to other work that he's recently
And if you want to know what this is, watch the whole video. Again, the link to it's in the notes.
been doing. So some of you may know Mark Lewis. I highly recommend you take a look at his work. Mark has been deeply influential in my own thinking. Ideas about dynamical processing, self-organizing systems development. He is one of the foremost important neuroscientists about addiction and how addiction works in the world. I strongly recommend reading his book, Memoirs of an Addicted Brain. So Mark was himself, I'm not disclosing anything confidential because it's right in the book, Mark was himself an addict in his youth, and then he overcame his addiction, then he went into neuroscience to try and figure out what is addiction, how does it work. Now, that's important because addiction is primarily the loss of agency. Right? It's not, addiction is distressing and painful, but when we're talking about somebody being addicted, the way we finally diagnose them is by how dysfunctional they become, how much they lose their agency.
Now, it's important to recognize that dysfunctional here is also within an arena, okay? Because someone might say that Billy laying out here on what another homeless person deemed the foundation of the Lord. The sidewalk in front of my office is the foundation of the Lord. Billy laying on the foundation of the Lord, we would deem him as dysfunctional because we have some ideas and representations of what a functional human being should look like. And I agree with those. I don't think it's in Billy's best interest to basically spend 12 hours sleeping it off and 12 hours doing drugs. I don't think that's a functional way to live. And Billy probably gets a check every month from the government, and to the best of my knowledge, Billy isn't doing any crime. I haven't seen any evidence of it. I get used to seeing evidence of these kinds of things if you know enough people. But that's what's going on with Billy. And it's dysfunctional. It's dysfunctional as compared to ideas and representations and paradigms and archetypes of functionality.
Right? So you are a video game addict if you are playing video games to the point where you cannot pursue the goals you want to pursue in your life. You cannot establish and cultivate the relations you want to establish in your life. You cannot cultivate the kind of character or identity you aspire to. If the video gaming is robbing you of those agentic processes, then of course that is what we mean by addiction. Addiction is a loss of agency. Now, when you take a look at Mark's work, Mark Lewis, he challenges, right? I just saw him give a talk. I've been having lunch with him, but I also saw him have just a really good talk at the Society for Psychology and Philosophy, or Philosophy and Psychology. We'll get the order right. Just this past year. And he was not the only person making this point, but he articulated it with his own particular explanation, which is his. So the point that many people are making is the standard model of addiction is incorrect, fundamentally wrong. What's the standard model? The standard model is we have a biophysical chemical dependency, and when the chemical is removed, we get an overwhelming compulsion to have to seek out the chemical. And if we don't get the chemical, then we suffer.
I sped it up there because, like many people, I listen to different people on different speeds. But if you listen to this on a certain speed, then it gets multiplied. So I'm going to back it up because what he said right there was really important. I don't want it to go by too quickly.
To have chemical are making a particular person, and he was not the only person making this point, but he articulated it with his own particular explanation, which is his. So the point that many people are making is the standard model of addiction is incorrect, fundamentally wrong. What's the standard model? The standard model is we have a biophysical chemical dependency, and when the chemical is removed, we get an overwhelming compulsion to have to seek out the chemical. And if we don't get the chemical, then we suffer, similar to as if we were starving from a lack of food, And so that's what addiction is. And the problem with this is it sounds very commonsensical and the media likes it. It has the one unfortunate feature of being almost completely false. Because first of all, you can get addicted to process.
Now we might ask, why does the media like it? Why do we like it? Why? So the dance with respect to addiction and morals is a complicated one, because morality is extremely powerful. And what often gets lost when people get full of their own moral self-righteousness and certainty is nuance. And when it comes to addiction, there's a lot of nuance going on here. It's not just a chemical dependence. There's a lot going on because it's tied into everything that we are. Now, why are we talking so much about addiction in this video about transformations? Well, we'll get there. But because addiction is a fundamental negative transformation that many of us are familiar with, but it illustrates the complexity of these transformations. And John's going to go there.
Processes that have no biochemical basis, like gambling, for example. Secondly, if the overwhelming compulsion model was correct, you have a great deal of difficulty explaining some very, very pertinent facts. Most people spontaneously give up their addiction in their 30s. We, of course, get focused on the people who remain addicted, and therefore we come to believe that addiction is an overwhelming compulsion. But if you actually track people, many people spontaneously stop being addicted. Here's a great historical example.
Spontaneously is an interesting word because some things in their life brought them to seek a transformation. Now, whether or not, when we say spontaneously, it might appear spontaneous to them. It might appear self-authoring to them. I've known a number of people who, let's say they had a few DUIs, but then gave up drinking. Just themselves. They didn't go through a 12-step program. They didn't go to detox. They didn't do any of that. They cold turkey. They did it themselves. You find lots of people like that.
You have soldiers in Vietnam during the Vietnam War getting addicted to opioids in Vietnam. The opioid crisis! Not that it isn't a crisis, but we tend to think that certain chemicals are intrinsically addictive. So,
not to say that certain chemicals aren't in terms of addictive as opposed to other things. Certain chemicals certainly tend to be more prone to addiction than others, but
they get addicted to heroin. When they return to the United States.
Now, if you understand John's whole work in terms of the meaning crisis, again, one of his best videos he does with Christopher Mastropietro about the symptomology of the meaning crisis. And so the opioid addiction is not simply, as usually the tale goes, that I had a surgery and they put me on opioids and now I got on them. Well, that may very well be true, and certainly the type of substance it is lends itself to that. John certainly would recognize that opioids are more addictive than acetaminophen or ibuprofen. They're more powerful. They have that effect. Now, the point he's making is that many people went over to Vietnam and in that context of war started doing drugs. And when they came back, they didn't do drugs anymore, which might lead us to believe that the opioid addiction is not just a story about doctors writing scripts. It's also a story about the big stories that we are nested within.
The vast majority of them spontaneously stop using the drug. But why? Chemical, not in the body. What's going on? Isn't there a biochemical lack and therefore a huge compulsion? Well, think about it. Think about it in terms of existential learning. See,
he just wrote Agent Arena on the whiteboard. He doesn't always say what he writes on the whiteboard, which is the downside of just listening to his stuff. There's a podcast version, there's a YouTube version, but he just wrote Agent Arena on the board.
When they were in Vietnam, They had a particular identity. They're a soldier.
As an agent, they were a soldier.
And they're in a particular arena. War.
And the arena was war.
They're in a particular existential mode. When they return to the United States, they become a citizen, right, in a peaceful country.
Now, some would start drinking, and because the agent in the arena doesn't just evaporate. And if you listen to Rhett and Link, there's plenty of there's plenty of leftover from their formation, even though the transformations that they're talking about in their links happened 2013, 2014, if you can put, to the degree that you can put dates on these kinds of things. There's a lot going on here. So you have, I talked to the pastor from, it wasn't quite in Nova Scotia, but, I talked to the pastor that we talked about post-traumatic stress and what it means to be a soldier and what it means to the warrior culture. And now you come back to Canada from a warrior culture and you're asked to change. Well, this agent-arena relationship is different. Talked about, Tim Keller's illustration from his book Preaching of someone, let's say someone who was a Viking versus someone who is a young man walking in New York City. Biologically, there's a great degree of commonality between those two, but the agent and the arena are in very different places, and those arenas are very much going to determine what's going to happen at every level within the person.
The relationship between the agent and the arena is what is fundamentally being altered in addiction. So Mark proposes a model that he calls reciprocal narrowing. So here's your agent, and here's the arena. And what happens is the drug use is associated with a particular agent-arena relationship. And what happens is, and we talked about this before, remember, this is always co-identification. We're always assuming an identity and assigning identity in a co-defining, interdependent manner. What happens is you start to lose a little bit of your cognitive flexibility, perhaps due to something like this. As you lose your cognitive flexibility, the number of options in the world starts to decline.
Now, what do you mean you lose your cognitive flexibility? Again, he's pointing to all the stuff that he had written in the part of the lecture before when I'm playing. I'm not going to play the whole lecture. The whole lecture is an hour long. Plus my commentary winds up being 2 hours. The whole video will be 4 hours then, because I got another lengthy portion of video to play with Jordan Peterson and David Nasser. Lose cognitive flexibility. What do you mean that? The menu of options that are before you has fewer items on it. Okay? This is something that you see often in people when you talk to people through their problems. People will often come to me and say, I had no choice. You had no choice? What do you mean? Could you have said no? No, I couldn't say no. Why couldn't you say no? Then she'd be mad at me. Oh, that's not a choice that you're making? So what if she's mad at you? I don't want her to be mad at me. Oh. So what happens is the options narrow. And what happens in addiction is that the only choice becomes, let's say, to drink, okay, or to sleep on the foundation of the Lord.
Right? As the number of options start to decline, you lose the variability for your agency. As you get a tighter, narrower, less flexible cognitive agency, the number of options in the world goes down. And what happens is these two things reciprocally narrow.
So the option is, oh, I woke up this morning, have a drink. Well, the more you're drinking, the more of your money is going into drinking. Your options are narrowing. The time that you're spending drinking is large. On and on and on and on and on and on and on. It can happen with computer games, can happen with pornography, can happen with relationships, can happen with all kinds of things. Things just keep narrowing down and you lose your agency. And he's drawing a little sort of a cone on the board that goes down to the bottom until at some point you're laying on the foundation of the Lord and you've got two modes. Your Your afternoon and evening, all the way until probably 2 or 3 in the morning, that mode is drug seeking and drug doing. And then your other mode from 2 or 3 in the morning to 11 or 12 in the afternoon is sleeping it off. Those are your only 2 modes. That's it. It's reciprocal narrowing. And your whole life, in fact, just goes down, 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 down. And it's, in a sense, a death of sorts.
To where you have no options as to who you could be or how the world can be. And that's addiction. It is a learned, not propositionally learned, perspectively, participatory learning of a loss of agency.
Now, this, if you've been following the John Vervaeke stuff, you know that there are 4 P's in knowing, and propositionally is one of those 4 P's. Perspectival, participatory. Whenever I get 3, I can never remember the 4th, and it's always a different propositional, perspectival, procedural, participatory. Those are his 4 ways of knowing. If you go to my blog, I've got them listed there. Maybe I'll remember to put the notes in. If not, and if you want it, just leave me a comment and I'll drop a link in. But one of the interesting things that when you listen to a lot of these transformation, these deconstruction videos, is that, especially for Christians coming out of an evangelical world, propositional is a biggie, okay? It's a biggie. Now, it's one of the 4. You're never going to be without it. It's always going to be there. It's a vitally important level. But again, if you listen to the whole video, I was listening to this video again today. I think I should just probably do a whole video or bring this video back up when I start to deal with the propositional level more directly, because this isn't just true in Christianity. He's demonstrating how it's worked in the history of Buddhism. It's an important level, but if it gets disconnected or out of balance with the other levels, things become a problem. And
I pointed out to Mark that if this is the case,
that reciprocal narrowing, that funnel sort of whirlpool down, 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 that's what he did with his finger.
There must be an opposite. If there's a spiral down, there must be a spiral up. And in personal communication, just recently, he said, yes, yes, totally. And you know what that spiraling up would be. What would be the agent-arena relationship in which the agency and the world are expanding? That's anagogic.
Now, as Job said, something about, Vervaeke language, Vervaeke's borrowing from the Greeks there. How does that fit in with Rhett and Link's story? They're feeling that, and if you listen to their story, they're feeling that their breaking out of Christianity is anagogic. This is a leveling up. This is, instead of going down into the filter, down to nothingness or death, they are going up, and their world becomes larger, their world becomes bigger, their menu of options become larger. That's what they feel happening in them. Now, is it true? Because here's part of the thing. If you go into the rest of John's work, we have what he calls, now some of you will be offended at the language, others of you don't care, call to use Harry Frankfurt's bullshitting. We're fooling ourselves. It feels like it's getting larger, but it's actually getting smaller. I'm a better driver when I drink. Are you really? Well, I often find this with conversations with people about pot. Is pot making your life better or worse? It's not always necessarily an easy thing to tell, because maybe they had pain, maybe they had chronic pain, maybe they had trouble unwinding, maybe they had trouble sleeping. How can you tell if pot is making their life better or worse? Well, probably whether or not, in fact, it's expanding. But expanding, how are you tracking this? We're probably going to do it with respect to story, with respect to one story within the context of other story, because not only is the agent a story, but the arena is a story. And I'm not saying they're merely stories. I'm saying that's the level at which we conceptualize them, which we can dialogue through them back and forth. That's what we're doing. Now, John is about to connect this to the Buddhist story.
That's the move towards enlightenment. What I want you to...
And there's a reason we're using light, because if it's dark, we don't have agency. The arena is dark and the agent is helpless. Enlightening means turning on the light. Well, now you can be a far better agent within an arena, and you can make your way through. This is part of the reason Buddhists talk about enlightenment. Enlightenment comes up, the Enlightenment in Western history. Read the Gospel of John. Jesus is the light of the world. This Sunday is Transfiguration Sunday. Jesus shines like the sun. That's his transfiguration. That's his transformation. So all of this stuff is connected.
Understand is dukkha is these two things because they're...
Okay, dukkha is suffering in Buddhism. And so earlier in this video, John's wanting to reinterpret, or at least interpret or offer his interpretation of Buddhism in terms of what are we talking about when we're talking about all life is suffering.
Interpenetrating this loss of agency, because this is your agency. As you're simultaneously doing parasitic processing within, you're doing reciprocal narrowing without. Those are totally reinforcing each other. That's dukkha. And no matter where you turn, this is always threatening. You can't get free of it. You can't run away from it. You can't deny it. Remember, the Buddha tried self-denial. This is like trying to hop over your shadow. You can't do it because it is endemic. All of this is endemic. This is the agent-arena relationship. You can't do away with this. This is indispensable to you being a person. This is self-organizing, relevance realizing, complexifying, processing. You can't get away from that because that is what makes you adaptive. So what do you do?
And adaptivity gives you agency in multiple arenas and...
That's what the Buddha meant when you realize that all of your life is threatened by dukkha. He didn't mean believe that all of life is suffering.
That's the propositional level.
So,
okay, that's what I'm going to play from the video. If you're interested in it, and now I want to make a comment about using John's work and using Buddhism, because I know for a lot of Christians that can get a little reactive to that. I think it's helpful to use these illustrations from other religions because we're not as bound up in all of our history. We can, in a sense, see them with a little bit more objectivity, perhaps, because we can watch similar dynamics going on in them as we have in our own religious arenas, okay? So I think that's part of the reason why this is helpful. So John talks about the agent-arena relationship and talks about the fact that we can understand addiction as a narrowing, and then we can understand enlightenment. Now, this word, very interestingly, is used by Buddhism. It's used by the West in terms of the Enlightenment. And what was understood by that enlightenment is not a narrowing, but an expanding. And Rhett and Link see the transformation that they have undergone as an expanding. And if you listen to both of their stories, as they tell their own stories, these are the kinds of terms that they use. They feel more free. They feel less constrained. That is how that is how they are perceiving it. Now, to evaluate it, as we're going to get into a little bit later in the video, is actually remarkably difficult, because I might feel, let's say I decide that I am, let's say Adderall. Let's say I decide, well, I'm going to start taking Adderall because I've always been ADHD. They didn't really have that language when I was in school. I wasn't on Ritalin, so I'm going to take Adderall. And I start taking Adderall, and I can talk about the transformational effects that Adderall have on me. And I feel like I can get more work done. I feel like I can concentrate better. I feel like I can... There's a really fun documentary on Netflix about Adderall. And, you know, things are going really well. Things are going really great. Well, is that really going to be just an expanding thing? Because maybe Adderall works for me in time, but later maybe it won't. Just, I didn't see. The problem with doing these abridged and longer versions is I never remember, because I just do it all in one sitting. I never remember which one I actually made the comment in. But, I mentioned how I want to lose weight, want to eat better. Well, sometimes I get in a habit of drinking a soda in the late afternoon. I'm not a coffee drinker, so I don't take caffeine in the morning, and I don't drink alcohol, so I don't. A lot of people are on the take caffeine in the morning, take alcohol at night, and so you're using those tools to sort of manage your day. And you might feel like that is enlightening. It is expanding your agency. It is making your life a better thing. So, but sometimes in the afternoon, I've been working for a while. I'm not as sharp as I was in the morning, so then I will drink a soda, have some caffeine, and boom, yep, I'm starting to get my work done. Well, maybe with Adderall, whoosh. Now we're really doing something. Caffeine is one thing, Adderall is another. But things that I notice once I start getting into this soda habit, well, a few weeks will go by and I'll notice, okay, I really shouldn't be drinking the soda. I've gotten off of diet sodas because I noticed that, drinking those things, some of those sweeteners, they're not very good for you. So then, there's a particular Pepsi that has cane sugar. You can drink Mexicoke that you can get at Costco with cane sugar in instead of the high fructose corn syrup. But then I'll realize that I'm drinking a soda every day. I really shouldn't drink that soda every day. So now I'm going to get off the soda kick. And you know what? The next day comes around and 3 o'clock hits and it's like a little bit of a headache. My body's conditioned to having that soda. And not only my body, I've talked to some people who've tried to quit smoking, smoking and Facebook for a friend of mine. They just go together. And so when she finally had to quit smoking, it was really hard. And, smokers always deal with these kinds of things. And so again, if I take Adderall, it might feel in the moment like enlightenment, like I can get more work done, like everything is better, like my horizons are opening. But over a certain amount of time, I might discover that wasn't really the case, or it was temporarily the case. Again, these things are very difficult to figure out, and we use stories to track them. Now I'm going to play quite a bit of the video of Jordan Peterson's conversation with David Nasser. Now this happened when Jordan Peterson went and visited Convocation at Liberty University, and there was an event that happened there. Those videos have been out for quite a while. The talk with David Nasser was really interesting. They first begin talking about suicide because the person who rushed the stage because he wanted to meet Jordan Peterson was struggling with suicide. But then they eventually got into what I think is the far more interesting part of Jordan Peterson's work, which again is all about transformations, but trying to figure out the relationship between internal transformation, my agency within, and the degree that the arena functions like an agency, or the degree to which we conceptualize the arena as agency, and the way that actually helps in terms of breaking addiction, in terms of anagogic, as Vervaeke would call it, in terms of enlightenment, in terms of extending my horizons of being a better person. And actually, most of this conversation is germane to this. So, again, if you're watching the abridged version, if you want to see the rest of the version, the link to the main videos, the original videos, are in the show notes. The expanded version will be on the same channel. I'm releasing them the same day. So let's start that video. This is Dr. Jordan Peterson. One last question. It's not on Jordan Peterson's YouTube channel. It's on the Liberty University YouTube channel. And again, I'll put the link to it in the notes below. They were just talking about suicide. And now this is a really fun video to play in the context of Rhett and Link, because David Nasser would be exactly the kind of, not exactly, but close enough to the religious context that Rhett and Link have grown out of. And so David Nasser's agenda is, in fact, Christian conversion. And what's fun about him talking to Jordan Peterson is Jordan Peterson isn't exactly on that same agenda, but he's adjacent to it and he's conversant in it. But now they're going to be talking about addiction and basically the agency of the individual and the conceptualized agency of the arena. Now, of course, for David Nasser, the agency of the arena, if you look at my videos about the meta-divine realm versus, say, God, the agency of the arena for David Nasser is, in fact, God. For Jordan Peterson, he's more of an agnostic. I usually call him an open agnostic, okay? And that's what makes this conversation fun, because Jordan Peterson, the real insight was, the real thing that Jordan Peterson did was reconceptualize God to a whole generation of young men, which suddenly made them interested in, what if exactly this is more than a conceptualization? And this is exactly why Rationality Rules has a problem, because he sort of opens the door to the conceptualization, and lots of people say, I don't want to just go to the movies and watch Star Wars. I want to live in that universe. And that too is very, very human. So David Nasser is going to start by doing the pastor thing. And if you're a pastor, you can see a lot of pastor tricks in what David Nasser is doing in this video.
As a pastor, what I say to a student who is overwhelmed, when they see a giant that's bigger than them.
Again, the conceptualization. When they're overwhelmed, what are they overwhelmed by? They're overwhelmed by their class. They're overwhelmed by all these things. They see a giant that's bigger than them. That's powerful stuff. It's an image. It's a story. It's something that's viral, something that's relatable. Again, pastors major in this stuff.
Instead of saying, oh, it's not a giant, instead of discounting the pain or minimizing.
Yeah.
But notice how they're using stories to manage the complexity of their lives. We do that all the time.
I go, you know what? That's bigger than you.
Yeah.
But it's not bigger than God.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay, well, what's God? God is the everything. So that's bigger than, here's little you. This is bigger than you, but it's not bigger than God. That's a powerful story. And you'll watch religious and unreligious and non-religious people conceptualize this way. Now, again, in religious terms, well, this is exercising faith. In Jordan Peterson terms, this is working psychology. Is it one or the other?
And I know it sounds like a cliche sermon little zinger, but we just say, yeah, I don't even pretend that you have the power on your own to slay this Goliath in your life. But we believe that, God hasn't left you. As a matter of fact, in this very dark hour, that's when he's closest to you. And so we're not looking for you to do this in your power, but we're looking for you to do this, and the power of the one who died on the cross for you.
Okay, right there. Your power, or no, basically the power of the arena. But is that power in the arena? And can I really interface with that power through all the kinds of things that Christianity or other religions tell me I can interface with that, through that power with?
Are we giving people false hope? Well,
and now Nasser turns and says, now I'm going to jump into the secular sphere and say, is all this BS? Is this really true? Watch Jordan Peterson's answer.
We do that as Christian counselors? Are we?
Does it work?
It does.
Jordan Peterson asks, does it work? And David Nasser says,
it doesn't work all the time.
Right.
It doesn't work all the time, but it does work. Sometimes.
And again, I think you're right. Sometimes I'm talking to someone who literally needs, because of a chemical imbalance, needs medication. So it's not...
Chemical imbalance. Okay, now we're going to jump over into the medical field. We're going to talk about the chemical field because, well, Christians understand that we're both.
Is, hey, here's a sermon and then they're good.
Yeah.
And it's chiropractic too. What I
Yeah.
mean by that is you don't adjust and then it's fine. You have to adjust again and adjust again. You have to keep continuing to go to counseling and continue to get help.
Pastors are masters of images. Successful pastors know how to work story and image to help people work through, help people do anagogic, to help them get out of the reciprocal narrowing and get into the expansion, the enlightenment. That's what pastors' jobs are.
It's a dance. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
People have a relationship with the transcendent. Like we're remarkable creatures, and I think for us to call on that relationship in times of dire need is perfectly appropriate. And you're providing people with the language for doing that. There is a lot of potential locked up inside of each person, and the precise nature of that potential is unknown. It's often referred to in religious language, and to let someone know that there's more that they can call on than they may have yet called on, I think can be extraordinarily useful if people can walk down that path.
Now, he did exactly what Rationality Rules complains about right there, because this is what Jordan Peterson does. He walks that line and says, well, they can call on more than they know. Well, where is that more coming from? And Jordan's an agnostic, so he's reluctant to say the more. He's reluctant to talk about the ontology. Well, see, even that. He's reluctant to talk about the... He's walking that line because he says, well, if it's manifesting in reality, if it works, there's something to it. But where is the source of that something? Is it the individual psychological? Is it the intersubjective? Is it, and now he's a Jungian, so there's a lot of layers to that Jungian conceptualization that Jordan Peterson is obviously well aware of. But this is exactly the line that Jordan Peterson is very interested in. And it's exactly the line that almost everybody's very interested in. Because we want stories of transformation, and we want stories of positive transformation, and we want to know where can we find the power for transformation, and where can we find the power to level up. Look at the language.
What about those who maybe aren't suicidal, but are in a place where they're just overwhelmed with mistake after mistake after mistake in their life? And the place where they're just overwhelmed with mistake after mistake after mistake in their life. And they're just looking for a first step out. What advice would you give them?
Well, I think partly what you do under those circumstances is you do a little bit of meditation, and you decide first that you want your life to be better.
You want a transformation.
That it would be acceptable in the sight of God and the universe if your life was okay, if you were doing well.
Conceptualizing again the arena as an agent, as a person who has opinions and will. Okay? Now again, for Peterson, this is on the line of psychology, that this is a conceptualization, this is a representation, but that representation, in fact, is powerful.
And then you concentrate on what you could do, what you could stop doing that's not good for you. And
of course the rationality rule. Well, he only gives declarative. He never gives normative. No, he's just given a whole bunch of normative things, as Adam Friend had pointed out in his video about destiny.
And I think that's a repentance in some sense, and I'm speaking about it, I would say, in a psychological sense rather than a technically religious sense. It's like, it's easy to sit on the edge of your bed and to think, look, there are things I'm doing, there are things I'm not doing that I should be doing, that I could and would do. Small things. You don't want to get grandiose, but you can start to improve your life incrementally by eliminating those things that are self-evidently making you bitter and miserable. But you have to decide that that's what you want. You're willing to burn off that dead wood, to sacrifice that bitterness and that unhappiness, even though you may feel that you're justified in harboring it. You may even be justified in harboring it, because people have very hard lives and sometimes they're very badly mistreated. But you need to think, it's okay if things improve, and it would be worthwhile for me to start to abandon you could say my sin, my failure to make the mark right, my failure to take proper aim, but to abandon those things that I'm doing that I know to be harmful to myself.
So Peterson's talking about a transformation. And the transformation that Peter is admonishing is a transformation that many people who have followed Jordan Peterson have taken. They've read 12 Rules for Life. They've cleaned up their room. They've stood up straight with their shoulders back. They've pet a cat. They've tried to to tell the truth, or at least stop lying. They have tried to do what is meaningful rather than what's expedient. Peterson has been all about transformation.
What would you say to pastors who think, well, why would you stop short of trying to get them to self-help or try to get them to, when you could go even further with them, not just only deal with the symptoms and those things, but just actually then provide them a faith that,
Well, with a
Okay, now again, look at what David Nasser is doing. Anybody who's familiar with evangelical Christianity knows exactly what David Nasser is doing, and Rhett and Link would listen to what David Nasser is doing, and I don't know what they would do because I haven't listened to them hardly at all, recoil or what have you. But now again, the arena for David Nasser is quite full and real, quite active, and so what pastors should give them something else. Well, how do you give them that thing? Well, you tell them the gospel, or you do something like this.
bigger
if you're
than
a
that.
pastor, you probably should ask that question. I mean, the issue is, the issue in a situation like that is that you have to govern your response to the person in accordance with that person. You know, you have to see where they're willing to go next, like, and you want to make sure that your destination, which might be,
Or your arena.
which could be, let's say, your pride in your role in their salvation,
Right.
for example.
Or BSing. That would be your pride. I mean, your filter doesn't get in the way of, see, but right away, what you're seeing is the arenas are moving around here. Which arena is it? Now they're not necessarily on the same page. They're definitely not on the same page, but they're conversant, at least good enough to at least be able to have this conversation and make progress and find some places in the middle to meet.
Oh yeah.
Doesn't interfere with your careful noticing of what it is that they need right here and now.
And so now need, again, is another thing. So what does Billy out there need right now? Maybe he needs me to go out there and pick him up out of his stinky sleeping bag and throw him against the wall and say, "You're wasting your life." Does that help? I'd probably scare him pretty good. You don't think he'd respond positively to that. Maybe I should leave him alone. Maybe I should get a homeless navigator from the city of Sacramento to try and connect him with services. And well, maybe, and Jordan Peterson says, don't forget the observer in this. Maybe I'm thinking, I'm going to do this. I'm going to talk about this, and this is going to elevate my status in the eyes of some. Maybe, I can save Billy. And well, maybe I'll get Billy sober, but then maybe Billy won't come to my church, or maybe Billy will come to my church. On and on and on. So I've got to watch myself in this thing. But Peterson's saying, now you're looking for the good. But again, that good for the other is also, there's some commonality in terms, we want the good to be opening, but even the, as I talked about a bit about before, even the interpretation of the opening is also within a context. So this stuff gets really complicated.
And so you want to push people to their limit, but to their genuine limit,
Yes,
right?
but you don't want to tear the fabric of trust by
No, and you
Right,
and
by
you don't
pushing
want to
too hard.
make them. You don't want to make them into puppets of your desire. You can lead people, but you can't. Let's say you can't remake them. Like you can lead them, and to lead someone appropriately, you need to know where they are. And that means you have to pay attention. And I would say, well, for some people, the religious approach initially might be the right one. There's some evidence for that, for example, in the treatment of alcoholism. I mean, the alcoholism literature indicates quite clearly that perhaps the only effective known treatment for alcoholism is actually religious conversion. I mean, sometimes people stop of their own accord, and we don't exactly understand why, but religious conversion actually seems to be quite effective, and it isn't clear why. The 12-step people capitalize on that.
Now, again, talking about the agent-arena relationship from the Vervaeke video that we just watched, we even have this built into our language. He drove her to drink. I was listening to the Aaron Rodgers transformation video, and what does Aaron Rodgers do when he loses a game? He drinks. Well, what is the relationship? I'm not saying Aaron Rodgers is an alcoholic, and I'm not part of a tradition that says drinking is always wrong. But what's the relationship between Aaron Rodgers losing a football game and Aaron Rodgers drinking? It's not biochemical. It's something else going on. And this is part of Vervaeke's point that addiction is not just chemical reactions. And Jordan Peterson now notes that actually, if you want to deal with the chemical of alcohol and the influence it's playing in someone's life, you're probably going to have to deal with what we call their life, which is their story.
And there hasn't been good scientific studies of the effectiveness of the 12-step program because it's hard to do controlled studies. But
well, because I think I sat with a gentleman one time who is a 12-step program guru. He travels the world. So he said, hey, what are you doing? And I told him, I travel and speak. And he said, oh, I travel and speak. And he said, what are you going to? And I said, I'm going to this church and I'm, going to go.
Notice how David Nasser was using the secular language. What do you do? I travel and speak. And if you talk to a church person, I'm a traveling evangelist. No, I travel and speak. You probably also eat and sleep and read and think, all those things too. Travel and sleep. Relevance realization here.
Preach. And he said, oh, I'm going to a rally, an Alcoholics Anonymous rally. And he pulled out his coin and he said, I've been sober. And he gave me the days. It was a long time. And he said, and I said, well, how do you begin? I said, he asked me, I'm sorry, he said, how do you begin? I said, I always begin with the word. I always open up the Bible to make sure I'm not, that's the foundation of anything I have to say.
Okay, so now here's his arena. Now, obviously the Bible, and you get into Rhett and Link, the Bible's a big deal. Bible is, especially in Protestant theology, Bible is the foundation. And now all of this imagery is going to come into David Nasser's conceptualization of this, and watch how Jordan Peterson sort of works to translate it.
Yeah.
People ultimately don't need my opinion. They need the truth. And he said, I always begin with the same, because it's interesting. He said, I always begin with, hi, my name is, and I am an alcoholic. He said, because we believe once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic.
Right.
And I said, you haven't taken a drink in 1,100 days or whatever.
Yeah.
He said, yeah. He said, I teach people. He said, but we believe one. I said, that's the difference for us. We as believers believe, I once was lost, but now I'm found. I once was Saul, but now I'm Paul. I once was an alcoholic, but now I have a new identity. So are we just preaching to ourselves? Please be just very honest with me. Are we just lathering it up and preaching that to ourselves? Because we've seen the evidence of saying to someone, when Christ gives you a new identity, you can...
Identity. One of the most important words you're going to hear, LGBT stuff, okay? Identity. What happened when there's an author, Melinda Sellis, I think her name is. She has a hilarious article, The Gay Roman Emperor Gene. Were the Roman emperors gay? Well, they'd have sex with men. And were they pedophiles? Some of them would have sex with children. They'd have sex with men. Were the boys, or were the Greek tutors who had sex with their pupils, were they gay? Now, what happens when you take something like that is you have an identity. Well, Christian, let's use that one. Christian. The identity is, in many ways, you might think, well, the identity is the agent. No. The identity is a relevance realization move between the agent and the arena. The identity is something in between the agent and the arena. And John Vervaeke noted that in his video when he said, the soldier is at war and the citizen, war in the foreign country, and the citizen is at peace in their home country, okay? So the identity has everything to do with the context. And now the context here is, well, alcohol, or the context here is the far broader sin. And so I am an alcoholic. That's context within alcohol. I am a sinner saved by grace, let's say, to use Christian language. The context is an entire story. It's the agent-arena relationship.
You're no longer, because we've seen the evidence of saying to someone, when Christ gives you a new identity, you're no longer a slave to the things that you were a slave to. You're now a slave to righteousness. Now, growing in that identity doesn't mean there's not a struggle, doesn't mean there's not temptation that you can fall into, and understand your weak points.
Well, I think it's more of a cautionary technique on the part of the 12-step people. They assume. So
Jordan now wants to nuance. Well, okay, let's not push the hi, my name is Paul and I'm an alcoholic. I'm always once saved, always saved. You hear Rhett and Link talk about that. Once alcoholic, always alcoholic. And Jordan Peterson saying, yeah, but that's a technique. I think he's right.
That alcohol, especially for people who are really susceptible to alcoholism, is sufficiently powerful so that some people can't risk any relapse. And I think that's true with alcohol. It's a very dangerous drug, and I think that is true for a minority of people. There are studies of alcoholic recovery where the people learn to drink moderately. And there's been a huge debate in the alcoholism treatment literature about whether total abstinence or modified drinking is more effective. And I haven't looked at that literature for a long time. It's been decades, I would say. But the last time I did look, the argument still hadn't been settled. But it's quite clear that for some people, alcohol is so dangerous that it's safer for them to assume that they don't have the wherewithal to make a single error. But remember, they're talking about something that's a fairly focal part of their life, right? They say, well, I have this one overwhelming temptation and I have to treat it with tremendous respect. Your question is more about personality transformation in general, and
how it plays out even into the trenches of addictions. I mean, I'm a Christian. I became a Christian when I was 18. My addictions didn't stop, tempting me, and it's not just even the things that I had before I became a Christian. I've added new temptations as a believer. Trust me, they don't go away. But rather than tapping into self-power or tapping into even good things like the accountability of a community and those kind of things, for me, it's so inside out. I just have to continue to preach to myself.
It's a funny
I'm
issue,
acting in contradiction to my new identity when I succumb to it. And I do succumb to it sometimes. But when I do, I have to tell myself, I just acted in contradiction to my new identity.
Okay. So there you see the interrelationship between the agent and the arena. That's where identity is. Okay? And what he's saying is that there's a relationship there, and the agent isn't acting, so the identity is in a sense a second self. And he wants to live up into this second self. He wants to become this new identity. All right? So the identity isn't just a given thing or a found thing. It's also an aspirational thing. And it's very much in context with the arena.
Not as a complement to my new identity.
So as a Christian, I mean, you're called upon ethically to act in a Christian manner.
Yes, sir.
And so there's obviously some assumption that your voluntary actions are part and parcel of an ethical requirement and also part and parcel of the faith. But then there's also the correlated claim that the salvation is through Christ.
See, now Jordan, this is what Jordan's very interested in. And you saw when he wanted to interrupt, but Nasser wouldn't let him in. If you're having a conversation with Jordan Peterson on video, you got to be really careful. Go look at the first Sunday special by Ben, what is it, Shapiro? That's it. Peterson's very interested in this because here's the question of agency. Is the agency just below or is the agency above? And one of the things that you see in the Rhett and Link conversations is that the agency of the community they felt was a little bit too domineering. Going to Los Angeles, you could really hear this in Links. They're sort of free. They could sort of ease off, and they had this freedom to do their transformation. But now Peterson is saying, well, where's this agency coming from? Is it the individual? Is it the individual's agency, or is agency in the arena? Because in many ways, again, if you look at the metaphysical realm versus the God dichotomy that I keep pointing to, that's the question that Peterson's very interested in, because that's the agnostic says, I don't know. I don't know if I can choose between the metaphysical realm and a God, which is a person and has agency and all of those things. That's something that Jordan's very interested in. And so he sees this tension in Christianity. In fact, he sees it more clearly than a lot of Christians see it. And he wants to kind of probe this and explore this with David Nasser, because where is the power and the agency coming from?
And so there's a funny contradiction there that's difficult to reconcile, which is that on the one hand, it's the action of something transcendent that's leading you out of perdition.
God, Jesus.
But on the other hand, you're still called upon to act as voluntarily as an active agent. And so
Faith and works. This is a long conversation in Christianity, of course.
it's a very tricky business to separate out how much you put on the person, let's say.
Calvinism versus Arminianism.
This is up to you. This is your responsibility to draw the bow back and to hit the target properly. And how much you attribute to the grace of God that allows that to occur. And
So I was a Muslim, before I became a Christian. And before, it was always, the responsibility was there. It's, hey, as a responsible religious person, here's the list of do's and here's the list of don'ts. And by the way, they were all good for me. Those lists of do's were like, they were good do's. And the list of don'ts were, they were not evil. They were actually for my benefit. They have a lot more than 12 rules. They've got a lot of rules. And even on the Old Testament side, there's over 600 do's and don'ts of the Mosaic Law. But it was no longer for me, responsibility is reimagined in the life of a believer, and that it's my response to his ability. And so responsibility is, now that I'm a Christian, I'm responsible to love my neighbor, to love the Lord with my heart, soul, mind, and strength. First of all, I'm going to fail at that. So Christ has already done it for me. He's the perfect model. Second, I'm walking in obedience, not to earn his favor, but because I've already been given. And so I feel like the power has been put in me. That's resurrection power.
So now, if you go through David Nasser's talk here, he's looking at the storified theology of this interrelationship between the agent and the arena. But the arena, of course, is highly personalized, and the agent is both a recipient of grace, which is something that is between them, that's something the arena does to the agent. And, so he's laying this out here.
Now I've just got to walk it out. I've got to flesh it out. I've got to grow in it. By the way, I say that.
yeah, so
and
that's
I've already
another...
See, and right there, because, well, what is I? And that's what Jordan Peterson wants to know. And if you go back to Michelle Williams, who is basically saying, I want to have control of my story. And Jordan Peterson is too good of a psychologist, too good of a clinical psychologist to just let that think, well, what is you? Where does that come from? That is by no means as simple and as easy and as low resolution thing as Michelle Williams wants to imagine, because you are formed. And in many ways, this is what's going on with Rhett and Link. They're working through this stuff. They're trying to find who they are. My wife and I have been watching this Netflix show, Love is Blind. And it's interesting because now my wife and I have been married 32 years. And we had a little getaway this last weekend, and she said, we've been married 11,511 days. So happy anniversary, 11,511. And so now we're up to like 11,515 days together. Well, and everyone in that Love is Blind show says, I want to be loved for who I am. But the more you watch the show, these are people mostly in their 20s and 30s, some of them quite dramatically, well, you don't know who you are because you are a lot inside and there's a lot outside. And actually understanding where the line is between inside and outside, not so clear. And if you want to see that's not so clear, go to another culture and look at their outside and their inside. In fact, we always do this quite dismissively with other people. Well, if you were born in a Muslim country, you'd be a Muslim. Oh, well, if you were born to Muslim parents, you'd be a Muslim. Where's Dave Nasser? He's born to Muslim parents. Now he's a Christian minister at Liberty University. What's going on with that? Well, it's because he moved to North Carolina. Yeah, probably. But where's the inside and where's the outside? And so when you listen to Rhett and Link, There's a lot of those questions. They're a little bit older. They're in their 40s now, but I'm in my 50s. We're all still working through those things. These things don't go away because we just see people as bound by skin. But remember, we're stories. And the story outside and the story inside, we're always working this, and they go together. And this is exactly why people are nervous about these Christian influencers, because they're relating stories out there, and that's going to have impact on other stories. So it's going to change us. And so it's all about the competition of the stories. And that's what Jordan Peterson's getting at. Says, oh, no, wait a minute. How does this story work again?
Sinned a lot
well, that's
today.
a funny one too, because that's that same contradiction, is that and so I mean, when I'm thinking about these things metaphysically, I think so there's a Christian idea that Christ died on the cross to save us from our sins and to redeem the world. And I think, well, one of the things Carl Jung pointed out was that part of the reason the Enlightenment emerged was because there was observations in Christendom that there was still a lot of redemption that seemed to need to occur, despite the fact that this miraculous event had manifested itself. And so you have this contradiction that the redemption has already taken place, but there's still all the problems in the world. And so the way that I've reconciled that to myself conceptually, speaking metaphysically, is that, well, the death and resurrection of Christ, and it has to do with a...
This is kind of fun because what Jordan Peterson's trying to do is reconcile predestination and individual agency. And he's going to use time to do it. It's kind of fun watching him, work on this very interesting puzzle that theologians have been chewing on for hundreds of years.
The death and resurrection of Christ, and it has to do with a different concept of time, I suppose, is the death and resurrection of Christ has redeemed the world, but we still have work to do. And that those two things can be together. I mean, the logos has always been regarded as something...
David Nasser's like, yeah, I know this problem. We've talked about it for a long time.
Outside of time, right? It's outside of the past and the present and the future. It encompasses all of that. And so in some sense, there's a level of analysis outside of time where something could have already been accomplished. But within time, which is where we are, well, there's still plenty to do. And it seems to me that the reason I'm stating that that's a metaphysical statement is because, well, it's complicated and paradoxical. But it seems to me to be correct, is that there's a pathway laid out. It manifests itself to us, at least in part, in the voice of our conscience and in our knowledge of our ethical responsibility, and, well, in our knowledge of good and evil. And the ideal, the redemptive ideal, is there to beckon and to call and to aid us.
Notice the agency. The ideal is to beckon and to call and to aid us. Now, is that metaphorical language? Is the ideal actually a more than just an abstraction or a representation? Is it actually an agency? How would we know whether or not it's in its agency? Because we certainly relate to it as an agency, and in fact, we can't help but talk to it in those terms.
But there's no complacency. There's still the battle that we each have to undertake. And you can see this tension within Christianity itself, because the Orthodox Christians, for example, place a lot more emphasis, in my understanding, on the action of the individual, the attempt to become Christ-like in action and attitude. And
I don't think this is quite where Peterson thinks it is, but because it has a lot to do with the conversation I had with Brett Salkeld about sacramentality, because this is where really it begins to interface with the meaning crisis and of course in Christianity, what is with that bread and the wine? How does it work?
Yes, on the action of the individual, the attempt to become Christ-like in action and attitude, and less on the turning over of the redemptive process to to the redemptive figure. And so the Protestants and the Orthodox have been arguing about that for a long time.
Absolutely.
And I don't know how to rectify that.
Yes, sir. I don't.
Of course you don't. It's really hard.
I think Jesus is trying to redeem the world around me. I don't think Jesus wants to
Now I'd have my conversation with David Nasser about this conceptualization.
save America. I think he wants to save Americans. I don't think Jesus is going to fix Canada. You know, he died for Canadians. And so it's the
He died for squirrels too. You can find that on an old sermon way before this thing.
individual.
Right.
Now, if God's redemptive power is in me and it's working through me, and so all of a sudden the way I see my
Okay, now, again, this is what happens is God's redemptive power is in me, it's working through me. Now this is obvious. This is going to be very Christian move here. This is Christian theology happening, and of course, there's going to be some issues about individual. I mean, this is enormously complex, but he's giving, this is basically the Christian answer.
neighbor, the way I treat people with dignity, even if they don't treat me with dignity, the way that I show the fruit of the Spirit, the evidence of the Holy Spirit living in me. Certainly that's going to drop the crime rate if more people are doing that. Certainly there's going to be evidence of a bit of a turnaround in a community if a bunch of people in that community have the power of God living in and through them. But that said, it's certainly not going to be religion. I mean, the most messed up places in the world, I'm from Iran, trust me, the most messed up places in the world are the most religious places in the world. So for me, it's more about this Christ living in someone and then the rest of it fleshing out.
It's also your willingness to replace your current personality with an ideal personality.
Transformation. There we go. Back on topic.
And that might be a very productive way of thinking about it, is that there's the you that exists now. Like, many psychologists will tell young people that they're okay the way they are. And I never do that. I always say, well, you're nowhere near what you could be.
You love them too much to not tell them the truth.
It's just not appropriate to tell someone who's young that they're okay the way they are, because they have 60 years to be far better at who they are than they are now. And they need that adventure. And I think part of that, psychologically speaking, part of that language that goes along with the idea of having Christ inhabit you, let's say, and then having him work through you, is the decision that you're going to turn yourself over to the ideal and then allow that to act through you to the degree that that's possible.
Okay, so transformation. There's this ideal self, but there's the ideal, and again, Peterson's a Jungian, so there's the ideal self, but that ideal self is Christ. And of course, Rhett and Link know all this language. They were raised into it, to grow up into Christ. But that Christ is not, they're not going to grow up to be a first century, construction worker. They're going to grow up to be an ideal self, which is Christ in them. And, that's transformation. And this is the transformation that everybody wants in many ways, to grow up to become your best self. But what do you mean by best?
And then that ideal is fleshed out in this figure of the dying and resurrecting.
It's the person of the Holy Spirit is who I would turn. And by the way, it's a daily work. The Bible says, deny yourself. If any man wishes to come after me, deny yourself, pick up the cross daily, and follow me.
Yes, and that's
so
also
I have to
the
die
part
every day.
And that's also the part that's the part that's so much associated with responsibility. Like that dying, and again, I would speak psychologically here, is that, look, we all have preconceptions of the world. And in some sense, we have the whole world mapped out. And much of our map isn't accurate, and it's low resolution.
Now, this is really pertinent to the Rhett and Link thing. They had a mapping of the world. And what happened was they saw some other mappings of the world that seemed more compelling. So they have to update their map. That's the process that they're undergoing in transformation. You get some of the later Vervaeke videos and you recognize that the world is far larger and more complex than any human mind can map, even when we work together. What do we do with that? Well, we have to keep mapping, but we can't just live in uncertainty. And so here's where you get the Ian McGilchrist. You have the part of the brain that's dealing with the new stuff, and you have the part of the brain that's dealing with the mapped. And so it's always the interchange between those two things. And so these transformations are always happening. Okay? And they have to happen. Now, there's going to be boundary lines and tribal lines and propositional lines all over the place that we're going to sort of use to try to keep track of each other, because we want to know what each other is doing, because we have to do that in order to live together, because we really don't like certain kinds of surprises. Okay? To have your wife come home and one day and say, "Surprise, I've had an affair for 30 years. That's not the kind of surprise people want to hear. To have your kid come home and say, "Surprise, oh, yeah, there's a lot of things go through my mind. I won't mention any of them, but you can fill in your own. So this is all what we're doing. And so this process of transformation is constantly going on, really, and it should be. But what we want to figure out is if our new mappings are better. But again, this gets back into the thing. Well, would Adderall be a new and improved mapping for me? Well, some might say yes, some might say no. I tend to think no, and so I'm not pursuing Adderall. But these are the kinds of things that we're dealing with.
It needs updating. But what it means is that when we learn something new, instead of merely adding something new to something we already know, we have to let something we thought we knew die and have it replaced. And that's that daily death and resurrection. That's part of it, is to be acutely aware of your errors, which I think you do if you try to act out an ideal. Right? You see where you fall short.
I think if I try to figure out where I am on the map or self-evaluate, I tend to lie to myself. I'm really good at telling myself I'm okay.
So now we're getting into Vervaeke's larger project. These are all the ways we fool ourselves. And if I'm evaluating me by myself, I need another standard outside. Well, he'll say,
I don't need a psychologist to tell me I'm fine. But if I just put my life up against the Word of God,
okay, that's what they're using. But now, again, if you listen to especially Link's second talk, when he's saying, well, the Bible's a big book. And so what we tend to do is focus it down into certain relevant rules. So growing up, don't have sex with your girlfriend, don't drink, don't lie, go to church. You take that really huge list, you bring it down to certain rules. And then, but now that's going to be involved in your mapping. And Link tells a story about going to a party and getting drunk and telling Rhett, and then they work that out. And this is a constant part of the process that's going on. But we're always looking both for some standard by which we can measure ourselves that is not subject to our will, and looking at ourselves to try and see if we're doing that. And we desperately need other people in part of this involved in that process.
If I look at, and if I have community that's willing to tell me the truth, even if it's not what I want to hear, it's what I need to hear. My wife is the number one person in my life that does that. Then people that know me, they go, man, your life isn't consistent with what you preach and what you believe. And so I'm daily coming before community of accountability.
Right.
I'm daily looking at the Word of God. And I'm daily asking the Holy Spirit to reveal to me the places that I need to grow. And it's funny.
You're allowing the ideal to hold you accountable.
Yes, sir. And I feel, honestly, Dr. Peterson, I've been a Christian. I got saved when I was 18. By the way, I got saved for myself. That's why I feel like, looking back on it, God saved me from me. And so, because I was sitting on the throne of my life. But when I became a Christian, sir, I've got to tell you, I was a pothead. It wasn't even good pot. I would smoke pot. I would mix it with oregano and sell it to my friends. I'd tell them it's Italian pot. I wasn't even an honest crook, I was an alcoholic. There's so much. Everything in my life was broken. I was completely addicted to porn, completely addicted to me, completely bankrupted as a bonfire of vanity. So everything. And then...
So he needed a transformation.
Christ saved me. And
Notice the language, okay? Boom. He was the recipient of something.
Mouth. I called my youth pastor and said, I effing got saved. And he said, he saves your heart, but still got to work on your mouth.
Yeah.
And then he started discipling me and working with me. And
what
it's funny.
Was the experience like? Like, what was the,
yes, sir.
What was
So again, Peterson, well, he's a clinical psychologist, really questions, is curiously interested in transformations and willing to go to a place like this to learn.
What's the transformative experience like?
It's dying. It's dying to self, and it's understanding the exchange. It's not changing your life. People think Christianity is change. It's not. The changed life is religion. Here's stuff you need to change. The exchange life, it's not.
Another little pastor trick right here.
Not changing. To me, change is taking the old man and putting makeup on it. Mm-hmm. Exchange is if any man is in Christ, the Bible says, behold. Behold means what's happening internally is beheld on the outside. There's
another little pastor trick.
External evidence of the internal. Behold, he's a new creation. Mm-hmm. And so new creation means I'm not taking the old and cleaning it up. I'm taking the old and it's dead, bringing it to the end of itself. Because I didn't need makeup. I didn't need a haircut. I needed open heart surgery. I need a full new heart. Mm-hmm. And so then walking into that is growing into that. And by the way, it's a dance.
What precipitated?
But I've got to tell you, I feel more sinful today than I did when I first became a Christian. Because a sign of...
Now, this point, if you listen to... I'm not going to play clips from it in this video, but if you listen to Link, you'll hear him working through many of these different things. Because again, that they're both in very similar systems. Nasser comes in as an 18-year-old from Iranian refugees, converts from Islam to Christianity. Rhett and Link raised in Christianity and now no longer identifying as Christians. Remember, identity is something in between the agent and the arena. It's a public thing that is in many ways negotiated in public.
Spiritual growth for me is that I'm more sensitive to the sins in my life. Mm-hmm. So it's not that I'm like committing these massive, meaning on the scale of like, that's
pot and oregano,
right.
For example.
That's right. It's I think literally growing in Christ is not that I stop sinning. It's just my sensitivity to, as you grow in your love affair with your wife, it's not so much that like, it's no longer just good enough to just be faithful as far as physically. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be faithful in really paying greater attention to what she's saying. I'm going to be more sensitive to, and so as I'm growing, I sometimes feel like, oh, I'm a wretched sinner. And I look back and it's stuff I wasn't even convicted about a few years ago. And that can't be me, because no part of the flesh.
Now, when he says convicted, he means personally convicted, not convicted in a court of law, just to be clear.
Ever desires that. And that can't be me, because no part of the flesh.
Now they're getting back to the agency of the arena. So that can't be me. So he's Jordan Peterson understanding it metaphorically, David Nasser understanding it with a bit more. We don't even have the word. That this is a power coming in on me. And again, this is more similar to, say, the Greeks. I'm being possessed by Aphrodite because I see this woman. I'm possessed by the spirit of alcohol because I want to have a drink. I mean, it's that type of language, and it's a move within the agent arena relationship. But Christians don't understand this as a loss of agency. They understand this as an expansion of agency.
Ever desires that. That has to be the Lord. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just explaining where it's coming from for someone. And that's not to discount the help that people are getting from a great book like yours. I love your book so much. I probably pass it out like Tic Tacs, like to everybody, but I wish it wasn't $34. But
passed it out like Tic Tacs. I wish it wasn't $34. Dude, you got to find it cheaper somewhere. Get it in bulk.
I pass it out because I think it really helps people. And I love everything, but the subtitle says, it's an antidote to chaos. I just think, man, I need these 12 rules. But I don't know how that's an antidote to the chaos in my heart. Because you could keep adding rules, and I'm still... At the very best, I've just learned how to clean up the chaos.
Oh, yes.
But it's still under the current.
Oh, the rules themselves are certainly insufficient to eradicate the chaos. The rules are... Well, you talked about discipline as in disciple. I mean, partly what you do to straighten yourself out so that you can deal with the transformations of life on an ongoing basis in a manner that's not overly rule bound, is that you bind yourself with rules enough to become somewhat disciplined so that you can become a spontaneous ethical actor.
The rule part.
The relationship between the rules and the anagoge, okay? And in other words, the rules are a tool to afford the anagoge because, now I'm talking Vervaeke. It's a good word for it. The rules are there to afford the expansion, the growth of agency. The rules are there to afford the enlightenment. They're helping us scale up by narrowing some of the other things that are going to disrupt the progress.
Part is the rule part. I don't have a problem with. First of all, I came from a religion that was very much like, here are the rules. Second, I came from a home, being Iranian, where I learned to submit to authority. Mm-hmm. Third, but the intent behind it changed. I understand, even before I was a Christian, I understood I need boundaries. Without boundaries, no river without banks is a river. Mm-hmm. It's just a puddle. So I knew the power of rules and boundaries in my life. But now it's no longer doing to earn. It's not about doing to earn his favor. It's about getting that favor for free by what Christ has done.
Misery, deliverance, gratitude.
And then every day just letting that become an evidence of my faith.
You're accounting in part, and the faith is accounting in part for the presence of that ideal that can move in to replace what was there before.
Okay, so Peterson's back on this question of the agency of the arena.
So faith is just literally me trusting, him, even though I don't see it all. Mm-hmm. And I don't have to know it all to be able to trust
that's very much akin to the idea of trust in truth. Because truth gets people in trouble very frequently in the short term. But one of the things I learned a long time ago was that it was very interesting to live your life by attempting to tell the truth, because extraordinarily adventurous things occurred as a consequence. It's like the short-term consequence might be all sorts of scandal, and it frequently is, because to tell the truth often means to say things that people would rather not hear. But I do believe that, and this is an element of faith, and I think it's akin to exactly what you're describing, is that I've decided that I'm going to do my best to tell the truth on the assumption that no matter what it looks like to me right now, there isn't a better outcome than the outcome that's generated as a consequence of telling the truth.
Yes.
Right, and that's definitely something that I think has to be placed into the category of faith. I mean, it's rational, because you got to think, well, better to have reality behind you than confronting you, and maybe if you tell the truth, you at least have the real on your side. Right. That's something.
Yes, sir.
But again, notice with Peterson too, with the truth, I mean, the arena is it's given an agency in here, and so we're always dealing with the relationship between those two.
You certainly can pay a high price for that in the present, and I think that idea of faith in Christ is analogous to that. I mean, there's a tremendous relationship between the idea of Christ and the idea of truth, for example. And
well, he's literally the embodiment of it.
Of the truth,
he says in John 14:6, a Bible verse, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So the truth isn't a philosophy or a doctrine nearly as much as it is the person of Jesus.
And to swing back to the Vervaeke stuff, so the truth that is Jesus, and again in the Buddhism video, Vervaeke says, I don't like, truth is very propositional. It's very tied to propositional, but built within Christianity is this idea that, well, the truth is a person of the truth as a person. Well, what does that mean? Well, that expands from just propositional into the rest of the 4 Ps: participatory, procedural, perspectival. I got them all 4 just at once there. Woohoo! But that's in a sense what Christianity does by, Jesus is the truth.
It's a mode of being.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
and I believe that.
Yes,
I
sir.
think that's true. And I do think there is something, I don't think that redemption occurs, and this is the case in psychotherapy as well, and it's perhaps where the psychotherapeutic and the Christian religious endeavor dovetail. I don't think in psychotherapy there is any redemption without the truth. Psychotherapy is a search for the truth in the past,
Yes,
for
sir.
a search for the truth in the present, and a search for the truth in the future. And it is what sets people free, even though it's tremendously difficult. And there is a place where those conceptual worlds touch right there. So,
Yes, sir. You're
And that's pretty much the end of the video. But, you know, that was most of the video that we played. Again, I'll put the link below in the notes. You know, that was a tremendous conversation. Happened a little over a year ago, or a little less than a year ago. And it was beginning of April, because I was in Australia when I heard that Jordan Peterson is at Liberty University. I said, what? That's just crazy. And then the thing happens, and then they have this conversation. Whoo! Well, I'll get back to the rest of the video. Okay, Jordan Peterson and David Nasser, they're talking about transformations, and Peterson is very interested in transformations and the source of transformations, and they're talking about alcohol, and they're talking about religious conversions can elicit a sufficient transformation to break the addiction from alcohol and to afford this, gosh, Vervaeke's got me talking his language, this Anagogic, afford this opening up of one's life to afford new opportunities. And Peterson talks about his discipline of telling the truth is tough in the short run, but opens up new possibilities and opportunities in the future. And talked a lot in my commentary on that about the agent arena relationship. Christianity has agency in both the individual, the individual agent being you, and the arena. And we talked about identity being sort of halfway in between. Remember, we conceptualize their agency up instinctively. Now, Charles Taylor talks about in Secularity we have the buffered self. And this buffered self in some ways disrupts the interchange between that, because part of the dogma about secularity is that the agent cannot have any I'll use that word ontological, cannot have ontological agency. It can only have perhaps psychological, perhaps some perspectival agency, but and in fact the agency is still built into the language. And in many ways I see that as really the line of demarcation between many of the people that we're talking to. And again, you can see this in Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke's conversation about, you know, we're looking up and we're seeing agency, and can we see agency all the way up? Can we see all the way up? But Peugeot makes the point in there that we see agency up and we have agency down. And, you know, my point was that it's all of that functioning is functioning as if the universe is an agent. It's functioning, Jordan Peterson language, it's functioning as if God is real. Okay? And I think that's the only way we do it. And I think part of the reason is that because story being our second nature, story being sort of a machine code with which we use to our hardware drivers, the piece of software with it we use to connect with the hardware and make sense of this world that is far beyond our capacity to manage it. I think that's why that arenas have agency, and why religious language continues to be used, and I don't think is going away anywhere else. What happens in secularity is we believe that the self is buffered, that Jesus can't come into our hearts. Well, what is coming into our hearts then? That's the question. Because can we actually lose that conceptualization? Can we actually lose that figure of language? I'm very doubtful we can. Secularity resists this, for many good reasons, in order to try to improve the signal to noise ratio. Is it cloudy outside because I'm feeling blue, or am I feeling blue because it's cloudy? We do a lot of BSing ourselves with elements like this. The woman controlling the American space program, Space Force, from the gas meter at the Livingstone's church. I'm highly skeptical that is in fact what's going on. But this is part of the reason why in Western society when we sort of switch the eye patch over to the scientific image, well, that sort of helps us manage some things. But pay attention that that's a flipping of an eye patch, and that's a move that we make that we actually can't live within. All right? So what's going on with Rhett and Link? What's going on with these guys? A lot. All right? They've undergone a number of transformations. And again, these transformations, as Jordan Peterson mentioned, because this whole world is so far beyond us, we undergo these transformations. And these two, having some talent, being on a track of entertainment, having some people on much bigger frames, pulling them out there, kept changing their arena. And as their arena keeps changing, that agent isn't going to just be able to stay the same. So a lot of the pain that you hear in terms of their deconstruction and their transformation and the relational pain, both of them talked about the trauma that these journeys have had on their wives and on their children. And again, the evaluative, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Let's hold off on this stuff because, as I mentioned before, again, now the problem with splitting up my videos is I don't remember exactly when and where I mentioned it. If I imagine that, let's say, adding Adderall to me would be a transformation that would help my life, I'd get more work done, I'd be able to focus better, so on and so forth. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, I talked about my relationship with caffeine. Well, so when I was driving home from my little getaway with my wife, and I've got better eyes than she does, and when it gets to kind of dusk, she, that's usually when I'll drive, but that's the same time I'm getting a little sleepy, so then I drink a Coke. And well, now I've had some more caffeine. Now, is that going to set back getting off the caffeine stuff? Is Adderall a good thing for me? Well, it depends on the time frame, doesn't it? And so I know a lot of Christians are going to be jumping up and down yelling about these guys, but you got to give people time. And if there's one thing I've learned in ministry, it's that take the time that the Lord gives you. Okay? And be quick to listen and slow to speak. And because the judgments that I have right now, these snap judgments, might not be the same judgment I have later. Wisdom. All right? So Rhett notes at the end of Link's story that commenters will respond to their stories based on their own worldviews. That's exactly right. Their stories have been part of our arena. And so the agent arena thing is going to continue. Christians, a conversionist religion, is highly attuned to the impact of influencers. And so, they're impacting the arena. And one of the things that both came through quite clearly in Link's spiritual deconstruction was that Rhett had a big part to play. And Link mentioned that a lot of times when he's having these conversations with Rhett, he's not telling his wife the role that Rhett's playing in the conversation because he doesn't want his wife to be upset with Rhett. And at least one person has messaged me and basically blames Rhett for Link's spiritual deconstruction. And in fact, Rhett talks about that in his conversation when Link tells his story. So we do influence each other. We all are each other's part of the arenas. But even telling the stories in these ways exposes their Christian motivation. There was once a member of my church who would send me nasty emails. And now there's another person out there. I'll just tell the original story. But if you're listening to the story and you think it's you, it probably isn't. Because the individual I'm talking about, I really can't imagine is listening to any of my YouTube videos. But this person would send me emails after a Sunday and say, you are using me as an illustration. And I know you're doing it and you have to stop and don't write back. Now, as a preacher, part of you hears this and says, wow, I'm speaking to the heart. I wasn't thinking of this individual as an illustration. I don't generally I don't preach sermons to one individual within the congregation. I think that's a little bit unfair. But the end of every email was, don't write me back. And in a sense, when they're curtailing the kinds of stories they want to get back from Twitter, okay, but the evangelist within us, these guys are trying to share their stories of Anagogic. Vervaeke, stop colonizing my head. Of the expanding. I need a different word from the one Vervaeke was using, because I don't think Anagogic is going to communicate that well. I'm a preacher, not a cognitive scientist, okay? And my language has to be fairly vernacular. These two have experienced the expansion of their worlds, and they see this as a good thing, and they want to share this with others. And at this point, they quite likely represent, as is often they're coming out of a religious tyranny, and they're coming out into this bright light of day, and they've got new tools and new experiences, and they want to share this. They're just trying to share a good thing, as in the words of the movie The Color Purple. So they're acting in some ways as evangelists. And so Christians, quite rightly, begin to get a little salty in the new sense of the word, where they say, and they get upset and they get reactive, and this stuff is going to play out. I can't stop it. They can't stop it. Just going to play out. Just because it plays out doesn't mean you need to necessarily jump on one side or the other side's emotional train. You can transcend it a little bit and maybe take a look, and that's the point of this video, take a look at transformations, because these things happen all the time, and not just along religious lines, and not just along substance abuse lines. In fact, all of those lines are categories themselves that are pretty blurry themselves. Someone might come home and say, I'm not a Yankee fan anymore, I'm a Red Sox fan. There might, in some households, that might be serious business. Someone comes home and says, I've quit my job. I want to be a musician. I don't want to be an engineer anymore. Yeah, some wives are going to listen to that and say, ugh. Or some husbands are going to say, hey, what do you mean? I got to go out and get a job. I like being a house husband. There's a big world out there with a lot of people. So transformations happen all over the place, and they're not always welcome, especially by the people that you're close to. Another show that my wife and I were watching, Let Down, on Netflix, an Australian show, quite funny. There was a woman who was a lesbian, and she had a child, and with the sperm donated by a coworker, but for her, she was of Indian descent, and her Indian family, number one, didn't agree with her decision to be a musician, wanted her to be a doctor. Number two, didn't agree with her identity as a lesbian. Remember, identity is always between the agency and the arena. And number three, she was trying to pass off the sperm donor as her husband and have him show up in videos. And at the point, he said, "Hey, look, I'm sick of playing this role, lying to your family. You have to tell the family the truth." And these transformations are all over the place, but the lines that we see delivered to us by our culture right now are not the only representations or frames through which to see these translations, these transformations. Because, as I said before, these would be viewed in radically different frames in past centuries with radically different consequences. Okay? And so even the framing of them is very much now, and that shouldn't be forgotten in all of this. How can we measure better? Both testify that their lives are better. In their estimation, it was a positive transformation. They experienced this as, again, in Vervaeke language, Anagogic. They experienced this as opening. It's the opposite of what happens in an addict where they're losing agency. They feel that they themselves have more agency. Time tells with these things, okay? I think if you talk to David Nasser would say the same thing about his Christian conversion. Better is a function of the manifest image. The observing agent is built into. So in other words, we can't make this evaluation without seeing it from a perspective, which is why Rhett's comments about how everybody's going to evaluate this transformation is going to be very germane, because everyone will evaluate it through their own filters. And basically what I'm trying to do with this video is expand the number of filters that you have through which to evaluate this, because there's a lot going on here beyond they were Christian and now they're not Christian anymore. Oh, this happened because they moved to LA. Yeah, that had a part of it. Oh, this happened because they decided to no longer work for Campus Crusade for Christ. Yeah, that had a part of it. There's lots of things that had parts of this. And to say it was all down to one thing is, as they both said, it's dismissive. It's more complex than any of us can tell, just like David Nasser's conversion in the other way from Islam to Christianity is also more complex. And David Nasser's ability to embrace this whole language and to continue to preach and talk about this language, and from all seeming evidence, I can't see into the man's heart, obviously, to do so fully with full conviction. And they can't. Well, explain the difference between David Nasser and them. You can't. You don't know enough. You don't know enough. And you don't know enough all the way down. And so it is the way it is. Better, worse, well, you're going to bring your filters to it. It's part of the manifest image. They have intuitive sense of greater agency in the now. And that's sort of where we always have to be evaluating things. And Peterson touched on that. Well, you pastors better be a little careful. Yeah, as if psychologists don't have filters? Come on, Jordan, you know that too. The arena is part of our continual calibration and evaluation of how am I doing. Now, Billy laying down there, if I'd wake him, I'd say, Billy, how you doing? How's this lifestyle? You ask him the Dr. Phil question. How's this lifestyle working for you? Well, he's making the choice to work it now, but his, this reciprocal narrowing has brought him down to a little nub that's under a blanket on the foundation of the Lord at, I don't know if he's still there. It's down. He usually gets up around noon. At about noon, and having people walk by and so on and so forth. Jordan Peterson's Meaning Project is interesting because that little gyroscope. So is doing drugs at night and sleeping half the day meaningful? These two decided that meaning seemed to be following this path out. Okay, it's a conceptualization. Better, worse? Hey, you know what? Time tells. Christianity also, of course, has an imagination that, well, there's one God. There's one judge. So finally, all of our little permutations, we don't really ever know. We can't judge ourselves. We can't judge each other. So built into the Christian narrative is a judgment. And in that judgment, you say, okay, Paul VanderKlay, how much have you been BSing yourself? How much have you been deluding yourself? When I first started making videos, I got a lot of comments about me deluding myself. All those people have since wandered off because I make way too many videos to bother keep watching if you're not at least a little bit interested in them. But, I find making these videos meaningful, so I keep doing it. And even if I had fewer people watch the videos or more people watch the videos, I keep doing them because I find them meaningful. I don't find them terribly expedient. This one's long. I might have to break it up into a part 1 and a part 2, even with the abridged versions of the videos. So, yeah, this one's going to be a mess. Anyway, time. The untreated schizophrenic today says, I don't need the drug. There's a schizophrenic friend of mine who is right now in a care facility in Stockton because he's in his late 60s now, and he's been a schizophrenic all his life, and he walks the streets of Sacramento, and I often watch him. One of the particular streets that he loves to walk down doesn't have a sidewalk, and there's no lights on it, and sometimes I'll be coming back from a restaurant or a movie theater, and I'll see him walking on that street, so he's going to get hit. Well, he got hit. And so they took him to the hospital, and then they took him to a rehab facility, but they're not giving him any schizophrenic drugs. He doesn't like being in them. Look at the story of Son of Sam. Son of Sam, untreated schizophrenic, kills those people, gets sent to prison. The state puts him on those drugs, and now suddenly he sees the world differently. And I often think with many of these individuals, I usually am pretty patient with people. Am I too patient? See, time is a tricky thing. Time is a very tricky thing. If my friend now in his late 60s, because he became unmanageable for a nursing home and they started giving him, I don't even know if this is legal in California. California in the 70s and 80s, they reshaped the law so that you're free to be crazy. If in fact, for some reason, he would go to prison and they'd put him on schizophrenic meds and they worked well, if they did for him, would he say, you all weren't very loving to me, letting me be crazy? Not forcing drugs on me. See, in our culture right now, sort of like Michelle Williams, we imagine, well, it's the expression of my will. Really? Are you that sure that that little self that's doing that choosing that you feel really knows what's best for you? This is a really tricky thing because, again, One of the things I learned from my father, being a pastor a long time, if you're pastor long enough, you watch people in their stories. And they're very complicated. And you learn not to judge too quickly because you don't know. That's what Gandalf says to Frodo in the Mines of Moria. I wish Bilbo had killed Gollum. Gandalf reminds him, even the wise cannot see all ends. You don't know. Well, again, now as a Christian, well, the arena is an agent, and the agent does know, and the agent is the God and the judge and all of those things. And that functions then in your identity and in this aspirational self and on and on and on that we just talked about. Human beings have a very difficult time managing time and perspective. We look up through a telescope and, oh, there's a star. Oh, there's a nebula. Well, those processes move very slowly. And our lives are very short. And we make our decisions just in the moment often. Sometimes we make good ones, sometimes we make bad ones. Regularly, again, another homeless friend of mine, he and I talk for hours. I really need to drink less. I really need to get in to see a shrink. I really need to get on drug. I get on the right drugs. They don't fix it, but they help. Or, day in and day out. He's bipolar. Some day he'll be up, some days he'll be down. On and on and on. Looks at this guy, says, oh, Billy's depressed. No kidding, he's depressed. And these are the drugs he's doing. Okay, thanks for letting me know. How do you know? Well, we have the same drug dealer. Okay, everybody talks. Human beings are very difficult managing time and perspective, and time slips by, and as we're aging and decaying, we've got a limited clock, and that heightens the story. This is why we use stories. This is why we navigate with stories. This is why we understand each other through stories. This is why we storify up and we storify in, and we storify out. We can't help it. We have to do it. It's the only way we really are able to manage time, because stories manage time. The arena is a story too. Religions are long communal attempts to manage the agent-arena relationship in a systemic and organized way. It's a way to gain perspective and deploy it in a viral, scalable way for the improvement of the individual community in the world. That's what religions do. They're human authoring programs, both individually and communally. And there's written texts of them so we can track them and work them through. If you ask Rhett and Link, do you have regrets about how you grew up? They'll probably say, no, it was a great growing up. But they're managing it in story. And religions are ways of managing this across our lifetimes. Because the deconstructions of Rhett and Link, well, they're happening in 2013 to 2020. But that has everything to do with the decades they're living in, the centuries they're living in, and in fact, the millennia they're living in. Because all of those stories are nested in together. And all of those factors, we're not anywhere near as buffered as we'd like to imagine. If there's a way of BSing ourselves by imagining we're not buffered by the arenas that we're inhabiting, well, anybody who watches their story and wants to dismiss it will blame the arena. And they'll be upset with them for spoiling the arena. But all of these things are working up and down, back and forth. They're far bigger than we are. But of course, a preacher will say, well, yeah, that's bigger than you, but God is bigger than that. Well, what is God? Well, God is the totality of everything. Look at my conversation again with Brett Sokold. Now, I'll probably make some more videos about this. There's patterns going on. And again, watch the Aaron Rodgers religion. There's just a little take of it on YouTube, but the audio version is on Danica Patrick's thing. And if you listen to that, and you listen to Brett and Rhett, and you just listen to a whole bunch of them, patterns, all the same, all the usual suspects come up. Cosmological dissonance. I talked about with Brett Sokold. I'm still not sure I'm saying his name right. Moral communal dissonance. Family identity and continuity. Individual identity and continuity. That's a really big deal. You undergo a lot of different transformations. I come home one day and say, honey, I'm going to be a woman. It's major issues in the marriage after something like that. We're all connected with each other, and you don't just transition without having someone else transition. Let's say you're married to an alcoholic and you wish that they would stop being an alcoholic, and maybe in fact they get sober. You might not like the sober self. That happens all the time. So there's all these individual continuities, story continuities, and communal continuities in terms of the relationships that we're built in. There's pluralism, having to deal with pluralism. There's personal injury or trauma. That's not a big part of Rhett and Link's story. They both had terrific experiences with that. But for others, they felt oppressed. Non-dogmatic binary, Aaron Rodgers talks about that quite a bit. Hell comes up again and again and again. But the telling is also in an arena. So you present and posture in hope and anticipation of acceptance and approval. I mean, they got to the point where this is set enough in them that they can dare to tell their story, and they're hoping for affirmation. The person who comes out as gay hopes for affirmation. Again, remember, identity is somewhere between the agent and the arena. It's a negotiated thing. That's part of the reason Peterson was talking about pronouns, because our language of each other and our identity with which each other, it's all negotiated. It's not just inside, it's not just outside, it's within the agent arena. And that arena is biological, that arena is relational, that arena is historical. That's why all this stuff is really complex and really important. So you present and posture in hope and anticipation of acceptance and approval while still presenting some dissonance, authenticity, and independence. That's why if you say, it's just because you moved to LA, that's dismissive. I don't want to hear that. Well, certainly it's part of it. It's in fact, you say it's part of it in your story. Is it the whole thing? No, by no means it's the whole thing. No, human beings are way too complex to boil them down into one tiny little dimension. Okay? Way too complex. Human relationships, it's conceptual principalities that are at work in their story, whether or not they recognize them as such. Oh, I've been at this a while. I don't know how long this video. I usually try to keep a cap at 2 hours. So even I might chop this into 4 versions. You'll see on Monday when I put this out. I have to render it first, and then we'll see what it is. But anyway, thanks for watching. Notes for the things that I've talked about should be in the notes below. And if there's links that I failed to put in the notes below, ask for it in the comment section, and either me or somebody else who's paying attention will probably throw it to you. So thanks for watching.